Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're lying in bed, spiraling softly towards sleep, or just here to fill your headphones while working, showering, or pacing under a ceiling fan, you're in the right place. Tonight, we journey to the heart of an ancient friendship, the quiet unfolding of how wolves became dogs. This is slow science for tired minds, calm storytelling for curious apes. We're here to tell the untold story of this transformation, a 20,000-year pact, forged in firelight. But this is not the simple story you think you know. It begins not with a single moment, but with a slow awakening. If you're one of the strange and wonderful humans who enjoys long-form, science-based content told softly, where facts matter more than flair, and mysteries are allowed to stay mysterious, consider tapping like and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps this type of thoughtful, educational storytelling reach more sapiens around the world. I'd love to know where this story is being heard. Feel free to share in the comments if this is for focus, for sleep, or just for wandering thoughts. If sleep finds you before the story ends, that is perfectly okay. I've left chapters in the description so you can always find your place again. And now, our story begins. This time, with a shadow near the fire, and a gaze that lingered just a little too long. There is a kind of light that cuts through time. It flickers low against the snow-packed earth, pushing shadows outward in soft, irregular waves. Its warmth is modest, just enough to keep fingers from going numb, just enough to dry, sinew-wrapped tools resting near the coals. And just beyond its reach, barely visible in the veil of night, something watches, something breathes, a shape still, as Frost stands at the edge of the firelight. Its eyes catch the glow, twin reflections like pale moons suspended in the dark. It does not growl, it does not charge, it only waits. This is not the beginning of domestication. Not yet. This is not the story of man bending nature to his will. It is, instead, the quiet opening of something else entirely. A possibility, a question, and that question begins with a choice made not by humans, but by a wolf, roughly 35,000 years ago, across the great expanse of the Eurasian Mammoth Steppe. The world was cold, dry, and austere. It was the height of the Upper Paleolithic, a period defined by survival, where the margin between life and death was measured in calories, coordination, and shelter. Homo sapiens lived in small bands, rarely more than 20 or 30 souls, migrating with the seasons, following the herds, stitching their lives together with bone tools, fire, and memory. And they were not alone. The landscape was shared with other great predators, cave lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and also with wolves, Canis lupus, powerful, mobile hunters, with endurance to rival that of humans. Like our ancestors, they worked in groups, they cooperated, they communicated, they endured, but something strange happened. Something that would, over millennia, alter the fate of both species. Not all wolves stayed away. Some, it seems, began to linger near the strange fires of these upright creatures, these furless, fire-tending primates whose camps left behind bones, scraps, and discarded skins. Perhaps it started with hunger. Perhaps the scent of cooked meat on the wind was too much to resist. Or perhaps there was something else, a silent recognition of something familiar in the rhythms of the human band, a pack of a different kind. Most wolves would have fled at the first shout, at the clatter of stone against stone, but a few didn't. They waited, watched, they learned, and so did the humans. Imagine a night deep in winter. Snow falls without sound. The fire is burning low. And just beyond the circle of light, a pair of eyes glints in the dark. One of the humans stirs alert, but not afraid. The creature is there again. The same one, perhaps, seen the night before. It hasn't attacked. It hasn't run. It only watches. And somehow, its presence feels known. No words are exchanged. No understanding forged. But something has begun. Something older than speech. Older than story. A slow dance of curiosity, patience, and time. And time was what it would take, for neither species could afford sentiment. Survival ruled the night, and trust was not given freely, especially not between predators. Yet, over countless evenings, at the edge of countless fires, a fragile rhythm began to form. The wolf approached, never too close, and the humans tolerated its nearness. Sometimes they threw bones. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes the wolf was chased away. But always it returned. This pattern, this circling presence may have repeated across generations. 100 bands, 1,000 fires. A few wolves learning which camps offered scraps and which ones meant stones and shouts. And just maybe, a few humans learning that not all wolves were the same. That some, oddly, seemed to understand boundaries. Not every animal could have made this leap. It would have required something rare, a temperament that suppressed fear, softened aggression, and tolerated unpredictability. In evolutionary terms, this would be the earliest glimmer of what scientists now call self-domestication, a process in which an animal begins to select itself for tameness through choices made around humans. And those choices had consequences. The wolves who lingered near firelight would have faced new pressures. Fewer chances to join the hunt, more exposure to strange smells, unpredictable noises, human children. But they also gained access to leftovers, marrow-rich bones, fatty scraps, hides warmed by the fire. It was a trade, a gamble, a shift in lifestyle that nudged their behavior ever so slightly away from that of their kin. We see echoes of this moment in the archaeological record, in sites like Prehistory in what is now the Czech Republic, dated to around 30,000 years ago. The remains of large canids have been found creatures that do not match the typical wolf morphology. Their skulls are shorter, their teeth less robust. They are not yet dogs, but they are not entirely wolves either. They sit somewhere in between, an in-between place that mirrors their role in human lives at the time. Not pets, not livestock, not tools, just watchers, lurkers, potential companions. It is tempting, in the modern age, to look back and assume a straight line, from wolf to tame wolf to dog. But evolution does not move in lines. It drifts, it wanders, it tests and repeats. And for every wolf that lingered too long and was speared, there was another who kept just the right distance and returned the next night. In those quiet thresholds, neither wilderness nor camp, something ancient was unfolding, not in a single place, not at a single time, but across the wind-blasted expanse of the Paleolithic world, wherever humans carried fire and wolves carried curiosity. The two species, shaped by similar pressures, endurance hunting, social bonds, territorial cooperation, were orbiting one another like stars in slow alignment, not yet touching, not yet trusting, but already watching, and in that watching, something rare was taking root. Recognition. Recognition, after all, is not a matter of language. It is a matter of attention, of pattern, of presence. A wolf that returns night after night begins to feel less like a stranger and more like a fixture of the landscape. And in the stillness of the ancient steppe, where silence reigned and movement was rare, every returning shape had meaning. Perhaps the first shared moment came not through food, but through danger. Imagine a hyena skirting the edge of camp, its laugh piercing the dark. The humans stir. So does the wolf. It growls, low and primal, alerting the camp before the threat is close. Not because it wishes to protect, but because it too is wary, because fear is shared, and that shared moment plants a seed. The next day, a piece of meat is tossed closer than before. This is not the taming of a wild animal. It is the gradual realization that proximity has value, that mutual awareness can be useful. And over time, that usefulness starts to look a lot like trust. Modern studies on fox domestication show how quickly behavioral traits can shift. In just a few generations, foxes bred for tameness begin to wag their tails, seek human contact, and even show changes in coat color. It does not take tens of thousands of years to begin the journey. But it does take a choice, a pivot, a few individuals stepping toward a new path. And so it was, on those cold nights, that a few wolves chose to linger. Not because they were commanded, not because they were captured, but because something in them responded to the rhythm of human life. The smell of food, the warmth of fire, the sound of laughter, the crying of infants, the soft rustle of sleeping bodies under furs. They stayed and were seen. And over time, that simple decision to not run became a turning point in the story of life on Earth. Because these were not just wolves adapting to humans. Humans, too, were adapting. They began to tolerate the watchers. They began to recognize that not all eyes in the dark meant danger. And in doing so, they began to shift as well. Not in biology, but in mind, in what they could imagine living alongside. This chapter of prehistory is barely visible in the fossil record. No tools were invented, no bones deliberately buried, no carvings etched into cave walls, but something was stirring in the quiet space between species. A soft beginning, a warmth at the edge of fear. This was the birth of something unprecedented. Not dominance, not domestication, not ownership, but companionship. The kind that grows in silence, that watches from the shadows, that waits for no command, but arrives anyway. The fire burned low, the wolf remained, and the first friendship in human history had begun. It began in the cold, beneath a sky that never softened, not with comfort, but with necessity. A quiet alliance, stitched together not by sentiment, but by survival. In a world where even the wind seemed to ration its breath. This was not a gentle earth. This was the late Pleistocene. The Mammoth Steppe stretched out in all directions, a vast and treeless corridor of grassland, frozen and immense. From the Atlantic shores of what is now Western Europe to the eastern reaches of Siberia, it covered the northern hemisphere in a mantle of silence. There were no forests to muffle sound, no mountains to hide behind, just open terrain and sky, and the long, low hum of wind pushing across snow-packed soil. It was a biome shaped by scarcity and resilience, and somehow it thrived. Beneath the frozen grasses, roots stored energy like coiled springs. These fed colossal herds that migrated in silent processions across the plains. Woolly mammoths moved in matriarchal lines, their trunks sweeping snow from buried sedge. Steppe bison, thick-necked and nimble, left frozen trails across the mudflats. Wild horses stood motionless against the wind, flanks steaming in the brittle light. For all their size, these animals were prey. Predators carved the same trails. Cave lions, heavier than modern lions, and perhaps just as social, stalked the edges of the herds. Hyenas with jaws built to pulverize bone followed the aftermath. Short-faced bears, towering and solitary, moved through open spaces like storms, and among them wolves, thin-legged and tireless, moving not in ambush but in pursuit, built for the long run, for the long game. But not all predators walked on four legs. Homo sapiens were there too, scattered, cautious, persistent. They moved in groups no larger than a few dozen, setting up temporary shelters stitched from hide and bone, migrating with the seasons, and studying the movements of the herds with eyes sharpened by hunger. These humans didn't rule the Mammoth Steppe. They negotiated with it. To survive here was to understand energy as a language. Calories were the currency of life, and the math was unforgiving. Every action had a cost. To walk across a snowfield burned warmth. To light a fire demanded fuel, and fuel demanded time. A failed hunt meant more than an empty stomach. It meant frostbitten fingers, slower reflexes, compromised judgment, and when judgment faltered, so did the body. In this world, there was no margin for waste, and so every movement was precise, every footstep thought through, each fire positioned with care to trap heat and conserve fuel, each kill divided deliberately, the meat roasted or dried, the fat rendered, the bones cracked open for marrow, the hides scraped and sewn. Even the sinew was saved, twisted into thread to bind tools, stitch wounds, repair clothing torn by wind or tooth. Nothing was casual. Everything was calculated, and it was into this sharp, cold equation, this brutal ecology of need, that a few wolves chose to step. They stepped in cautiously, never fully crossing the boundary between wild and human, hovering just beyond the warmth, just beyond the reach of stone and spear. It began with scent, the bitter smoke of fire, the sweet rot of marrow, the unmistakable tang of cooked meat on the wind. For a wolf, every molecule told a story. There were bones here, and skins, and noise, strange rhythms of laughter, and singing, and sudden silence. There was danger too, the smell of fire, of fear, of sweat, but also stillness, and scraps. Not all wolves were drawn in. Most kept their distance, shaped by instincts that had evolved to treat upright primates as unpredictable, even deadly. But a few lingered, and it is in the lingering that change begins. Scientists today call it self-domestication, a quiet shift where the tamest individuals of a population begin to benefit from their calm. The wolves that flinched less, that waited longer, that didn't snap when approached, but lowered their heads slightly, or simply held their ground without growling. These were the ones that stayed close enough to benefit without triggering aggression. And the humans noticed, at first perhaps only as a curiosity, then as a pattern. Certain animals returned to the edges of camp. Their tracks were familiar, their behavior predictable. They scavenged but did not challenge. They observed without threat. They began to feel, not like invaders, but like shadows, background fixtures that moved with the people, then vanished when the camp moved on. Still, this was not companionship. Not yet. This was parallel survival, because humans too were stretched thin. Every day on the Mammoth Steppe was a negotiation with hunger. On some days the hunt succeeded, on others it failed, and bellies went empty. The cold magnified everything. A missed meal chilled the body. A chilled body lost sharpness. A dulled mind made mistakes. Mistakes could kill, so people adapted. They learned to maximize every gain. Fat was more valuable than meat. Liver, kidney, brain, these were prized. They cached meat beneath the snow to slow decay. They rendered grease into leather pouches, storing calories like wealth. Fire was not just for warmth, but for transforming food. Cooked meat preserved better. Cooked bones cracked easier. Burned refuse made the camp smell less appealing to other predators. In this landscape of tight margins, even a small advantage mattered, and this is where the presence of wolves began to mean something more. A low growl in the dark might warn of a hyena nearby. The nervous pacing of a watcher might alert a human child before she wandered too far. A distant howl might indicate the presence of prey or of danger. Without any training, without any plan, these animals began to offer something awareness. That awareness was not given freely. It was the byproduct of cohabitation. Two species, living near one another, alert to the same threats, alert to one another. The wolves learned human rhythms. The humans, perhaps unknowingly, began to learn wolf ones. They watched each other across the threshold of need, not with affection, not with fear, with attention. In a world as unforgiving as this one, attention was a form of currency. To be noticed was to be accounted for. To be known, even slightly, was to be less dangerous. And in that attention, small shifts began to emerge. The humans moved their camps with the seasons, but some wolves followed, not as pack members, not yet, but as persistent shadows. These animals, perhaps only a few dozen across a wide and scattered continent, had stumbled into a niche, not quite wild, not quite tame. Their presence became familiar enough that a thrown bone no longer signaled hostility, but something closer to tolerance. That tolerance, over time, became selective. The calmer wolves survived longer near the camps. The skittish or aggressive ones were driven off, or worse. This gentle pressure began shaping the population. The ones that lingered passed on their temperament, and slowly, imperceptibly, a behavioral rift opened between those who stayed and those who did not. It would take generations, dozens, perhaps hundreds, but the split had begun. On the other side of that fire, humans were also changing. Not in their bodies, but in their behavior. They began to anticipate the watchers. They noticed patterns in how they circled, where they sat, how they reacted to sounds in the night. Some of these people, perhaps the younger ones, threw scraps without fear. Others may have mimicked wolf calls, out of curiosity or play. Communication did not require language. A gesture, a pause, a gaze held a fraction too long. These were signals, exchanged without plan or intent, and over time, they formed the earliest vocabulary of trust. The environment that allowed this was relentless. Temperatures could drop below -40 degrees. Food was not promised. Storms rolled across the plains without warning. The people had only what they could carry: stone blades, hide tents, fire bundles cradled like treasure. Their lives were small, mobile, and exposed. So too were the wolves. The two species moved through the same ice-blasted geography, hunted the same prey, suffered under the same wind. They breathed the same air, and their breath turned to vapor in the same bitter cold. In that shared hardship, something softened. It is easy to imagine domestication as a singular moment. A man, a pup, a pact. But it did not happen that way. It happened slowly, gradually, in the space between meat and need, between eyes meeting across firelight. Before there were dogs, there were watchers. Before there were companions, there were survivors. And the Mammoth Steppe, cold and vast, was not the setting of that friendship by accident. It was its catalyst, its filter, the place where only those most willing to share space, silence, and risk could endure. The world did not offer mercy, but sometimes, in the long dark, it offered proximity. And proximity was enough to begin. But proximity was only the opening gesture. What followed was shaped not by distance alone, but by rhythm, the quiet choreography of movement, eye contact, and time. The wolf lingered near the edge of the camp, just beyond the ring of flickering firelight. The humans did not beckon. They did not threaten. They allowed. And the wolf returned. Not always, not predictably, but often enough that its absence was noticed. Over days, then moons, then seasons, the repetition of this presence became a kind of pattern. The same eyes in the dark, the same tracks in the snow, the same way it stood, not crouched in fear, not poised to strike, but balanced, watchful. That stillness began to feel familiar. This is how patterns emerge, not through intention, but through accumulation. And in the worlds of both wolves and humans, pattern is everything. A wolf pack is not ruled, it is orchestrated. Each member learns the weight of silence, the meaning of a pause, the signal of a glance. Roles shift depending on age, hunger, and strength. One leads today, another tomorrow. The strongest may not dominate. The quietest may guide the hunt. The pack survives because it moves as one. So too with Paleolithic human bands. They were not governed by hierarchy, but by balance. Someone remembered the water routes. Someone noticed when the bison herds turned early. Someone else, younger, lighter on their feet, could track an animal for hours without spooking it. And around the fire, an elder might tell a story so old it no longer had a name. No one owned the knowledge. It was dispersed, like light through smoke. Cooperation was not a moral choice. It was a survival tactic. To live on the Mammoth Steppe was to depend on others, not occasionally, but constantly. Food, warmth, protection, decision-making, each one was distributed across the group like muscle fibers in a single body. The cold would exploit any weakness. Hunger punished every misstep. No one lasted long alone. This is what humans and wolves shared, long before they shared anything else. Not intelligence, not language, but structure. They were two species wired for collective survival. And when those wires began to cross, the circuits found each other. Neither side knew what they were building. There was no plan, no pact. But the behaviors, the circling, the waiting, the observation, the restraint, these were old reflexes, and now they were running in parallel. The humans had seen animals before. They had fought them, eaten them, worn their skins. But this was something different. This was a predator that moved like them, watched like them, waited like them. And over time, those similarities began to outshine the differences. It was not mimicry, it was resonance. The wolf and the human did not become like one another. They simply moved according to patterns already inscribed in bone and breath. When two such patterns encounter one another, they do not clash, they synchronize. This is why the early watchers, the wolves who lingered at the edge of human camps, were not just tolerated, they were understood, not consciously, not through language, but through familiarity. Their movements felt legible, their choices made sense. And for animals living under the same cold sky, sense was sacred. What the humans began to notice, over time, was not just behavior, but role. Some wolves alerted them to movement in the dark, others barked at strange noises, then faded back into silence. Some followed as the group migrated, and when the group settled again, the same eyes returned. They were not pets, not yet, but they were beginning to feel like part of the camp. And this feeling grew because humans too had a map of roles, fluid, responsive, never static. When a child cried in the night, it was not only the mother who stirred. When a hunter fell ill, others fed him without debate. No one had to explain the value of a lookout or the burden of the weak. These truths were shared. Wolves cared for their injured. They fed pups too young to hunt. They waited for the slowest. They did not leave the old behind until the cold forced the choice. These were not exceptions. They were defaults. And humans, watching, saw it, not with surprise but with recognition. So when a young wolf limped near a fire and was not chased off, it was not compassion, it was instinct, an extension of the pack mind. And when a piece of meat was thrown farther than usual, it was not generosity. It was an experiment, a signal, a test of the line between near and near enough. The wolves responded. Some crept closer, some stayed back, and slowly, the humans adjusted. This was not training. This was mutual calibration. Each small shift was reinforced by repetition. If the wolf did not bite, the hand grew bolder. If the human did not yell, the paw crept forward. A rhythm was forming, not choreographed, but co-evolved. A dance of caution and curiosity. And beneath that dance, something even older stirred. The blueprint for this kind of relationship was not being invented. It was being remembered, not by mind, but by instinct, by systems built over millennia to detect safety, to reward synchrony, to lean toward whatever promised a better chance at survival. The wolves were not being domesticated, and the humans were not doing the taming. They were simply recognizing themselves. Recognition was the doorway. What followed was trust, but not all at once. Trust did not arrive in a single act. It came slowly, as most essential things do, in the weight of unbroken patterns, in the silence between steps not taken, in the growing pause before one creature fled from the other. It came in sleep. To sleep near another is one of the oldest risks. The body softens, the senses loosen, vulnerability spreads like warmth beneath the skin. Yet there are traces, faint but real, that some wolves slept near the outer edges of human camps, not for scraps, but for safety, and the humans let them. Somewhere in this unspoken arrangement, the outlines of partnership began to emerge, not as an agreement, not as a bond, but as a habit. The habits became roles. One wolf barked when something stirred beyond the trees. Another followed at a distance as the humans tracked game. These were not trained behaviors. They were extensions of what wolves already did for one another, for their pack, and the humans did what they had always done. They adapted. They watched. They remembered. They began to rely, just a little, to listen for the bark, to expect the presence, to feel, when a familiar shadow was absent, that something was missing. This was not yet the dog, but it was the shape of the dog's future. It was a future built not on submission, but on similarity. Wolves did not become companions by being conquered. They became companions by already being compatible. What made them special was not what humans added, but what wolves already carried. Endurance, social awareness, a sensitivity to tone, posture, rhythm. The very same traits that held human bands together now served to bridge the species divide. In this way, the dog was not a new invention. It was a refinement of something ancient. Two social predators, shaped by the same cold winds and the same hunger, finding in each other a structure they already understood. There are traces of this story in bones. Burials from as early as 14,000 years ago show dogs interred alongside humans, sometimes with care, sometimes with grave goods. But those graves came later, long after the pattern had been set. Before the burial came the presence, the watching, the return. The shape of the pack had expanded. It had stretched, quietly, to include something other, something new but not unfamiliar. And in the seasons that followed, as humans crossed rivers, followed herds, lit fires beneath open skies, those shadows followed too, not behind, not beneath, but beside, not just as watchers, but as kin, and kin stayed close, even in the dark. When the fire gave only embers, when voices fell to murmurs or silence, they remained. Shapes barely visible beyond the line of warmth, breath rising in clouds, ears turning to sounds the humans could not yet hear. The Paleolithic night was not quiet. It was filled with movement, the creak of shifting ice, the wind dragging itself across the plain, the far-off crack of something breaking under weight, and closer still, the scrape of claw, the rustle of brush, the shallow exhale of something waiting. Humans had always feared the night, for good reason. Sight weakened, cold deepened, and predators prowled. In the dark, imagination sharpened every noise. A snapping twig could be a lion. A gust of wind could be a whisper from the dead. And the fire, while precious, could only protect so much. So they stayed awake. Not all at once, not always fully, but in turns. A handful of eyes stayed open. Someone tended the fire. Someone watched the trees. In every camp, from every era, there is evidence of this rhythm of vigilance, distributed like breath. Even in exhaustion, there was always someone listening. And then, slowly, there were others listening too. The wolves had reasons to stay. Scraps, safety, routine. But they brought something with them. Not by intention, but by presence. Their senses extended the human perimeter. Ears tuned to higher frequencies. Noses mapping the world by scent. Their bodies registered threat long before it reached the firelight. It may have started as coincidence. A wolf growled at a shadow. A human stirred. Nothing happened. But the timing was remembered. And the next time, when the wolf bristled, the humans sat up. They began to link the warning to the outcome. Without commands, without collars, without control. Trust arrived in increments. It didn't take long for this pattern to matter. The humans began to notice which wolves were the first to react, which ones stood between the camp and the dark, and which ones, on the coldest nights, slept just close enough that their body heat reached the edge of the human circle. In the dark, even that warmth became a signal. No longer just scavengers, no longer just watchers. They were something else, something new, a living thread between silence and safety. Still separate, still wild, but not outside the group, not anymore. What had begun as tolerance was becoming interdependence, the kind that builds not through language, but through pattern, not through affection, but through reliability, the kind of bond that deepens quietly while the world sleeps. And the world did sleep, but someone, human or wolf, always stayed awake. The watch was not formal. No signal marked its beginning. No rule determined who would take the next turn. It was simply understood. One stirred when another slept. One listened while others dreamed. It was a rhythm as old as fire itself. And now, there were more ears in the dark. The wolves did not take shifts. And yet they too responded to sound, to scent, to motion. Their presence expanded the human senses outward, past the firelight, into the deeper dark. Even in sleep, they twitched and turned, their bodies alert to the smallest shift in air. Their growls were low, their warnings subtle, but they carried meaning. Over time, Humans began to tune their bodies to those cues. They slept lighter, they noticed patterns. A particular wolf might always stir a few seconds before danger moved close. Another might growl at nothing at all. The distinction mattered. It shaped the way humans interpreted the silence. This was not myth. It was memory, passed between generations through gesture and observation. We can imagine a winter camp, half buried in snow, the wind cutting through low shelters of hide and bone. Inside, bundled in furs, the people rest. A baby coughs. A man shifts in his sleep. Outside, near the glowing coals, a wolf raises its head. It does not bark. It only stares into the trees, and someone notices, not always the first time, but perhaps the next. And gradually, the presence of wolves becomes part of the night's vocabulary, a soft language of tension and release, of danger measured in posture, of calm defined by stillness. The fire, once the only boundary, now had extensions. It reached not just through light, but through awareness, a widening circle of safety, not defined by what could be seen, but by what could be sensed. The wolves made that possible, not because they were trained to, but because they lived by the same rules. To survive, you had to know what moved. You had to feel the shift in wind, the break in rhythm, the silence that meant something was watching. Wolves lived by that instinct. So did humans. It was this shared sensitivity, this mutual attunement, that allowed their night worlds to overlap. And in that overlap, the fear began to change. The night was still cold, still dangerous, but it was no longer empty. The humans were no longer alone. They were joined not by gods or spirits or carved talismans, but by living beings who kept the same hours, who guarded without being asked, who stayed, night after night, just close enough to be counted. It was not companionship in the modern sense. It was not loyalty, not yet, but it was presence. And in the long Paleolithic night, presence was everything. That presence settled into the landscape like another layer of warmth. It filled the space between sleeping bodies and circling embers, between the wind's low voice and the pulse of the earth under furs and feet. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but there. The wolves did not break the silence. They inhabited it. Their breath, slow and visible in the night air, rose beside the smoke. Their paws pressed faint patterns into the snow that ringed the camp. Their ears twitched in response to distant sounds, the shift of a branch, the snap of frost beneath hooves, the creak of a frozen tree leaning under weight. They were not restless. They were ready. And the humans, wrapped in sleep, had begun to dream differently. Somewhere in the back of the mind, behind the rhythms of exhaustion and the warmth of bodies pressed together, there was a new awareness, the feeling of not being alone, not completely, a subtle knowing that someone else was watching the dark, someone without words, without tools, but with instincts honed by the same world that shaped them. This quiet alliance was not measured in gestures, it was measured in continuity. The wolf came back, the fire was tended, the child slept through the night, the camp endured, and endurance was everything. In the morning, there may have been no sign of the wolves, just footprints, just a feeling. But sometimes they remained, still distant, still wary, but unmoved by presence. A companion not through domestication, but through repetition. Not all wolves lingered. Many were chased off. Some turned dangerous, others vanished with the snow. But a few, always a few, returned. The same eyes, the same posture, the same pause, just before entering the clearing. These were the ones who stayed, and it was their consistency that began to rewrite the rules of night. Children grew used to the silhouettes beyond the firelight. Adults stopped reaching for stones at the first rustle in the dark. There were still threats. Hyenas still stalked. Big cats still hunted. But fewer reached the center of the camp, because something else had already noticed. The wolf had become, without being asked, a guardian, not through training, not through ownership, but through proximity, through pattern, through the layered memory of nights when danger came, and something growled first. It would take thousands of years for that role to evolve, for the wolf to become a dog, for the camp to become a home. But long before there were collars, there were nights like this. Nights when the fire burned low, when sleep was deep, and when the eyes in the dark did not mean fear, but safety. Safety changes everything. It softens the edges of instinct, loosens the coiled spring of fear. It allows curiosity to stretch its limbs. And in the warmth of that fragile trust, some wolves made a choice. They stayed. Not all of them. Not even most. The majority vanished when the fire died down, or when a voice grew sharp. They were wild still, children of the forest edge, shaped by hunger and distance. But a few lingered, and lingered again, and in the repetition of their return, something ancient began to split, not a clean break, not a single moment. A drift, a quiet divergence written in behaviour, not bone. It likely began with the calmest individuals, those whose instincts did not scream at the scent of humans, who hesitated instead of fleeing, the ones who learned to wait just beyond the shouting, to approach when the spears were lowered, to circle the perimeter rather than bolt through it. And on the human side, something was shifting too. Their bodies had not changed, but their minds were adapting. They had grown used to certain shapes in the dark. They no longer mistook all movement for threat. They had learned, perhaps unconsciously, to read subtle differences in posture and gait. A wolf crouched low was danger. A wolf, standing tall but still, was something else. It was a new category, not predator, not prey, watcher. And as the watchers returned, again and again, their presence began to carry meaning. They were not forced to remain. No ropes held them. No pits captured them. Their choice to stay was its own kind of communication. It said, "Here is food, here is warmth, here is predictability." And for animals built to calculate risk, that predictability was powerful. The humans began to respond in kind. They threw bones a little closer. They did not shout as often. They tolerated nearness when the night was coldest. These were not conscious strategies. They were small accommodations shaped by repetition, reinforced by outcome, and over time, the outcomes began to stack. The wolves who stayed had better access to calories. They burned fewer in flight. They suffered less from injury. And crucially, they lived long enough to pass on their temperament. These weren't pets. They were pioneers of a new ecological niche, animals who exploited a human environment, not by hiding from it, but by joining it. And though they were still wolves in form, something in their behaviour was already turning, not because they were being changed, but because they had chosen something different. They had chosen to remain within reach. Within reach did not mean within control. These wolves were still cautious, still alert to threat. A sudden movement could send them skimming back into the dark. But the gap between flight and return was shrinking. They no longer vanished for days. They circled back within hours. They lingered after sunrise. They came to know the smell of individual fires, and the humans came to know them, not as individuals at first, but as types. One always followed at a distance. One barked more than the others. One slept closer when the snow was heavy. These patterns became part of the rhythm of camp life. Not commented on, but noticed. Not questioned, but remembered. And memory, in these early societies, was everything. No one wrote anything down. Knowledge was carried in the body, the story, the gesture. A child who asked about the eyes at the edge of the light might be told only, "That one doesn't bite," or "She comes back." These phrases, passed casually across seasons, became the scaffolding for a new relationship. What made it work was not domestication. Not yet. It was compatibility. The wolves who stayed were, in some small way, already wired for it. Their nervous systems didn't overreact to shouting. Their curiosity outlasted their panic. They could walk among unfamiliar smells without breaking down. And over time, these traits became more common not because humans bred them, but because the environment did. This is what scientists now call self-domestication, a process by which certain animals under specific pressures begin to select for tameness on their own. It's been observed in other species, like bonobos, who differ from chimpanzees not by chance, but by a long history of selecting for low aggression. It's not about obedience. It's about thresholds. How much can an animal tolerate before it flees? How long can it stay in uncertainty before it panics? The wolves who stayed had higher thresholds, and that made all the difference. Because around human camps, unpredictability was constant. Fires sparked and flared. Children screamed and ran. Spears clattered, wind shifted, and still, some wolves stayed. And with each generation, the line between the ones who fled and the ones who remained became clearer. From the outside, they all still looked like wolves. Sharp teeth, golden eyes, coats thick against the cold. But behavior was already telling a different story. One not written in fossil or fur, but in the subtle geometry of distance, in the way one wolf waited 20 paces away, while another sat 10, in the way one paced the trees, while another lay down near the meat pile. These were not random variations. They were the earliest traces of divergence. Not in body. Not yet. But in mind, in tolerance, in trust, and in the quiet, evolutionary gravity of choosing to stay. Trust, once seeded, does not grow evenly. It unfolds in small acts. A wolf that doesn't retreat when a child runs past. A human who doesn't raise their voice when the wolf noses closer to the scraps. A night when no stones are thrown. A morning when the wolf is still there. These moments built a foundation, not of training, but of expectation. Some wolves began following the group when they moved. Not all the way, not at the centre, but at the edges, parallel to the path. A presence in the periphery. They were not herded. They were not leashed. But they came. This shift marked more than behaviour. It marked intent, because to follow a group across a landscape is to invest in it. It is to accept that there is something valuable ahead: food, shelter, safety. The wolves who did this had begun to see human movement as a pattern worth attaching to. Their survival, once tied only to prey, was now tethered to something else, a new kind of opportunity. And humans, who noticed everything, noticed this too. They didn't call it domestication. They may not have had a word for it at all. But they felt its weight in the rhythm of daily life, in the eyes that met theirs across the fire, in the steady proximity of a creature that no longer vanished at dawn. What emerged from this was not a single lineage, but a fork in the path. Some wolves remained wild, untouched by these encounters. They kept their distance. They taught their young to avoid the scent of humans. For them, nothing changed. But for the others, the ones who stayed the world, began to shift. Their offspring grew up in the shadow of firelight. They learned to move through human noise. They scavenged with less fear, watched with more patience. And when they reached maturity, they too hovered. They too lingered. Natural selection played its quiet role. In camps where calm wolves thrived, more calm wolves appeared. In landscapes where proximity paid off, the genes that tolerated it passed forward. It was not a conscious process. It was not guided by human hands. But it moved, generation by generation, with steady force. And then, one day, a pup didn't just hover. It slept near the fire. No one chased it away. No one shouted. It woke, stretched, shook frost from its coat, and remained, as if it had never known another way to live. As if the fire and the humans and the night were all part of the same unbroken story. That pup was not yet a dog, but it was no longer only a wolf. It was something in between, a beginning, born not of dominance, but of patience, not of command, but of proximity. And it stayed. And where it stayed, the questions began. Not for the people gathered around the fire, but for us, those who look back through the smoke of time and wonder why. Why did the wolf remain? What pulled it closer? Was it hunger or something else? The simplest answer is meat. Human camps were rich in leftovers. The remains of mammoth and reindeer kills, bones split for marrow, skins scraped and tossed aside, feet and jaws and skulls too cumbersome to carry. Scavenging would have been easy, less dangerous than chasing elk across frozen plains. Less costly than failing a hunt, archaeologists have found the evidence in the earth. At sites like Predmosty in the Czech Republic and Goyet Cave in Belgium, piles of discarded bones show clear signs of human processing and later gnawing. Cut marks from flint blades overlap with tooth marks from canids. In some cases, the bones appear burned, cracked open, hollowed. A banquet for any creature with the courage to come close. And that's the crux of it. Not all wolves did. To enter the human orbit was a gamble. These were clever, dangerous primates who threw stones, wielded fire, worked in groups. But they were also predictable, their habits repeated. Their camps smelled of cooked meat, their waste piled up in the same places. Some wolves learned the shape of that rhythm. They timed their visits, came at night, watched from the shadows, took only what was left behind. In those early moments, they were scavengers, yes, but they were not thieves, not yet. They were opportunists balancing risk and reward, calculating where calories could be found without bloodshed. But perhaps it was not just about food. Proximity also offered protection. Human fires kept predators away. Camps repelled cave lions and hyenas. For a wolf alone, nursing an injury, or with young to guard, the human world might have offered a kind of buffer zone, a place on the edge of danger, but not swallowed by it. It's possible, even likely, that both factors mattered. A hungry animal doesn't separate motive from outcome. It follows the scent. It seeks the path of least resistance. But as wolves returned, as they circled the same camps again and again, they may have begun to play another role entirely. Not just takers, not just watchers, scouts, with better senses than the humans. With knowledge of trails and scents and the subtle movements of prey in snow, these early wolves may have detected opportunity before the humans did, and by following them, the people may have unwittingly learned. Not all value is visible. Not all scavengers are selfish. And sometimes, what begins as hunger becomes something else entirely. Something else was unfolding beneath the surface of need. These wolves, drawn first by scraps, began to show up before the scraps were offered. They circled camps where no feast had yet occurred. They tracked hunting parties long before the kill. And in doing so, they became more than mouths to feed. They became eyes ahead. This shift may not have been obvious at first. But humans are observant, pattern-seeking. And somewhere along the long arc of repeated interaction, someone must have noticed. The wolf barked before the herd turned. The wolf bristled before the wind changed. The wolf followed a trail the humans had not yet seen. And when those moments added up, when the presence of wolves began to coincide with success or safety, the story began to change. Not in myth, not yet, but in practice, in action, in the way the humans reacted when the wolves appeared. Less fear, more tolerance, a longer pause before reaching for the spear. It's tempting to imagine this in symbolic terms. The wolf as guide, the wolf as omen. But in the early days, it was simpler. The wolf as a kind of map, a moving signal that something prey, danger, shelter lay ahead. Not every wolf played this role. Most likely did not. But some individuals, already more attuned to human movement, began to act as unofficial pathfinders. They didn't lead, but they moved, and the humans followed, even if they didn't realize they were following. What's more, some of the archaeological record seems to support this layered interaction. In several Paleolithic sites, including those at Eliseevici and Mezerich, canid remains have been found with signs of proximity to human life, not just gnaw marks on bones, but canid skeletons among human refuse. One specimen even shows toothwear consistent with a diet of softer, human-provided foods. These were not just wild animals passing through. They were living close, eating differently, staying longer, and when they stayed, the humans began to adjust the perimeter. Waste piles shifted. Bones were tossed to the side instead of buried. Noises meant to frighten were softened into warning tones. Boundaries once absolute became flexible, situational. The people had not tamed the wolves, but they had begun to interact with them, not as pests, but as presences. Scavengers, yes, but also sentinels, scouts, perhaps. or simply shadows that moved with a logic the humans had learned not to ignore. What began as a unidirectional relationship, animal drawn to human, was evolving into something mutual, not equal, not conscious, but reciprocal. Each action prompted a reaction. Each visit shifted the future. And in this slow, low-burning exchange, something ancient was being rewritten. Rewriting takes time. It doesn't happen in a generation. It happens in the slow accumulation of decisions, 100 small choices that tilt a lineage toward a new way of living. And that's what was happening here. Some wolves were still just passing through. They came, they ate, they vanished. But others lingered. They stayed after the bones had been picked clean. They returned even when no food was offered. They shadowed the group as it migrated, keeping pace at the edges. And in those behaviors, something new was being tested. The boundary between species had always been real. One walked upright, tamed fire, shaped stone. The other hunted on 4 legs, lived by scent, and howled to the sky. But now the line between them was growing porous. Not erased, but blurred by routine, by familiarity, by the quiet understanding that there was value in being near. Value beyond the obvious. It's here that the scientific debate sharpens. Some argue the wolves were drawn only by waste, an ecological niche carved by human abundance. Others suggest that wolves offered services in return, whether intentionally or not. Warning, insight, company. The truth may lie in both directions at once, because nature does not require intention to create function. A behavior repeated enough times becomes a pattern. A pattern that benefits survival becomes evolution. And what began with a wolf sniffing at the edge of a fire eventually led to something deeper, a behavioral bridge. That bridge was not built in a lab. It wasn't designed. It grew from shared space, shared needs, and shared timing. The wolves who stayed became more than scavengers, even if that's how it started. And the humans who allowed it began to shift their sense of the animal world. Not everything that approached was a threat. Not every tooth meant harm. Some teeth tore into enemies. Some teeth stood guard. Even the way humans disposed of their waste began to change. What had once been trash became signal. The way bones were piled could invite or repel. A cleaner camp left less to lure scavengers. But in this new dynamic, that lure became a tool, a magnet for a different kind of animal. One that came quietly, asked for nothing, and gave something in return. It wasn't domestication, not yet, but it was alignment, of habit, of interest, of future. And perhaps the question was never scavenger or scout. Perhaps it was always both. Perhaps the wolves who came looking for scraps ended up offering something greater than meat, something like partnership, not through plan, not through force, but through the simple, patient motion of 2 species, learning to move through the world in tandem. Tandem was never simple when both creatures carried teeth. The closeness that offered opportunity also carried risk. For every night of quiet proximity, there was the potential for sudden violence. One wrong move, one poorly timed step, and blood could be spilled. The humans knew this. They had seen wolves tear into prey, had heard their howls split the air. A single wolf was a threat, but a pack was devastation. Spears and fire could hold them back, but not always. Fear remained in the bones, even when the animals no longer attacked. The instinct to defend, to chase, to kill, did not disappear overnight, and the wolves knew it too. They smelled the sharpness of stone blades, the heat of fire, the tension in human muscles when they drew too close. They had seen others killed for daring to test the boundary. Survival demanded caution. The same instincts that told them to linger also told them to measure distance carefully, to move slowly, to hold back. So the early relationship was not trust, not yet. It was calculation. The wolves weighed hunger against risk. The humans weighed curiosity against threat. Each night was an equation written in silence. How far could the wolf step into the circle before a stone flew? How long could the humans ignore its presence before fear overpowered tolerance? These were lines drawn and redrawn every evening, each encounter shifting the boundary by inches. Yet something began to change in that equation, because repetition dulls fear. Familiarity rewrites instinct. The same wolf, appearing again and again, was no longer only a wolf. It was that wolf, recognizable by its scars, its gait, the way its ears tilted when it listened, and with recognition came a new category, one outside the old binary of friend or foe, not trusted, not yet, but tolerated, counted, noted. This is how trust begins, in increments too small to name. The predator that could kill you is also the sentinel that growls when danger approaches. The animal that frightens your children is also the one that keeps hyenas at bay. Ambivalence gives way to complexity. Fear does not vanish, but it shares space with something else, something that leans toward reliance. The archaeological record shows this tension. Wolf remains at sites like Predmosti and Goyet carry marks of both reverence and butchery. Some skulls were buried deliberately, as if honoured. Others were cracked open for marrow. The relationship was not stable, not uniform. It oscillated between intimacy and violence, between recognition and survival. But in that oscillation, the lines blurred. The wolves that stayed were not entirely safe. The humans that tolerated them were not entirely merciful. Yet the pattern held, despite the danger. Each species began to accept the gamble, to live with the uncertainty, and slowly, that gamble tilted toward trust. Trust in this landscape was never absolute. It was provisional, fragile, tested each night the fire burned. The wolves circled close, drawn by scraps and habit. The humans allowed them, even expected them, but always with caution. Hands still reached for stones. Spears still rested within arm's length. Vigilance never faded completely, yet small changes betrayed a shift. The children, once startled by glowing eyes beyond the fire, began to notice which animals returned again and again. Their fear became curiosity. They whispered about the ones with torn ears or thick winter coats, pointing them out as if they were part of the camp itself. In this recognition lay the seeds of something deeper than tolerance. The adults saw it too. They understood the danger, but they also saw the pattern. The same wolves did not attack. The same wolves lingered. And when a growl in the night saved the camp from a prowling cat or an approaching rival, those wolves were no longer just tolerated. They were useful. Still, usefulness did not erase the tension. A wolf's teeth were reminders, sharp, white, and capable of ending a life. Even in moments of quiet, the potential for violence was present. A startled child, a poorly aimed throw, a clash of instincts, any misstep could collapse the delicate balance. That it held at all is a testament to the patience of both species. Patience and something else. For wolves, the camp was not only about scraps of meat, it was about safety. The fire pushed back predators. The presence of humans meant stability, a pocket of order in a chaotic landscape. The wolves that remained had calculated that nearness was worth the risk, and each time they returned unhurt, their calculus was confirmed. For humans, the wolves were becoming more than scavengers. They were an extension of the night watch, a signal that danger was near. They were also companions in silence. To sit at the fire and see those shapes watching with you, it was a reminder that vigilance was shared, that the night belonged to more than just people. Archaeological finds suggest this complicated relationship clearly. Some wolf bones were gnawed by humans, cracked for food. Others appear to have been buried deliberately, perhaps even with care. Both reverence and consumption existed side by side. This duality tells us the truth. The wolves were both partner and prey, both feared and trusted, both kin and resource. It was never simple, it was never pure, but it was movement in a new direction, a direction where trust was not given freely, but earned in the repetition of nights survived together. A direction where the sharpness of teeth no longer defined the entire story, because alongside those teeth was something else, the decision to stay, and the humans, seeing it, made their own decision, to let them. That was not a gesture of surrender. It was an act of calculation, as careful as the wolves' own. Every choice on the Mammoth Steppe was weighed against survival. If allowing these animals to linger reduced risk, if their presence sharpened awareness, then the risk of proximity became worth it. Trust was not born from kindness. It was born from necessity. And yet necessity shaped something that began to feel like recognition. The humans saw the wolves as dangerous, but not equally so. Some were still unpredictable, quick to bare teeth or lunge at scraps. Others, calmer, more patient, stood apart. These were the ones who earned a sliver of acceptance. They moved in ways the humans could read. They reacted with restraint, and that restraint became a kind of language. The wolves, for their part, also distinguished. Not all humans were the same. Some threw stones without pause, others dropped bones without fear. Some tolerated closeness in silence. Others raised their voices in warning. The wolves learned who was safe to linger near, who would allow them, who would not. They remembered, and memory shaped their choices. It was this exchange of memory, this slow layering of experience, that transformed presence into trust, not the complete trust of later ages, when dogs would curl in beds or guard flocks as kin. This was trust with teeth still visible, with danger still close. But it was enough to allow repetition, and repetition, across years and generations, carved a path forward. Archaeology shows us the tension clearly. At the site of Predmosti, wolf skulls have been found arranged with mammoth bones, possibly as part of ritual practice. At the same time, cut marks on canid bones prove they were also butchered, revered and consumed, honoured and killed. This duality was not contradiction. It was coexistence in its rawest form, trust and danger balanced like fire and frost. From this balance came the first fragile bonds. A wolf allowed to eat near the fire without being chased. A human child pointing and laughing instead of screaming. A night when the growl of a wolf warned the camp of something moving in the dark, and no spear was thrown in return. Each of these was small, but together they rewrote the relationship between two predator species who had once been only rivals. Trust was never absolute. It could break in an instant, but over time it bent the arc of their connection towards something different, something lasting, because survival was no longer only a human effort, no longer only a wolf's hunt. It was a shared watch, a shared risk, a shared gamble against the cold and the hunger of the Ice Age world. Between teeth and trust, something new had begun. Not yet friendship, not yet partnership, but the possibility of both. It meant fear could sit beside familiarity without shattering the night. Out of that uneasy blend, a new habit began to grow. Not a leash, not a command, a pattern. Wolves lingered at the margins. Humans allowed it. The same figures appeared evening after evening, and the repetition itself started to do the work. Unlike the animals that would later be broken to harness and yoke, these wolves were never forced into place. No corrals, no ropes, no walls closing in. What changed first was not body, but threshold. The calmest individuals could tolerate noise, smoke, laughter, the clatter of bone on stone. They spooked less. They waited longer. They learned the timings of meals and sleep, the safe hours and the dangerous ones. Natural selection favoured that calm. Near the camp, food came without a chase. Scraps of fat, cracked bones rich with marrow, skins heavy with grease. A wolf that did not flee at every shout saved energy. A wolf that did not lunge needlessly avoided injury. Longer lives meant more seasons to breed. More seasons meant more young carrying that same quiet nerve. This is the essence of self-domestication. No plan, no breeder's chart. Only an environment that rewards certain minds. Gentle pressure, night after night, winter after winter, sifting a population by temperament. Curiosity begins to pay. Patience becomes a strategy. The bones hint at this shift. At places like Predmosti, canid skulls appear with slightly shortened snouts and reduced tooth size compared to wild norms. Not dogs yet, but not quite the old wolves either. A drift had begun. It moved slowly, like frost working its way through soil, invisible until it is obvious. Modern experiments show how quickly behavior can tug at form. In the 20th century, silver foxes bred only for tameness began, within a few decades, to seek touch, to wag, to show piebald coats and softer faces. Behavior led, bodies followed. The Ice Age had no laboratory, yet it had the same logic. Where calmness prospered, calmness spread. Still, the animals of these camps looked and lived wolfish lives. They hunted when they had to. They howled when the sky was clear and the air rang like glass. But their reactions at the fire's edge were not the same as their cousins beyond the ridge. The startle was softened. The snarl took longer to rise. The gamble of staying felt less like a gamble. Humans changed too, though not in bone, in habit, in reading the signs. Hands reached for stones a little less quickly. Scraps landed a little nearer. Children learned which eyes in the dark belonged to trouble, and which eyes belonged to the watchers who always came back. No one named this shift. No one carved it on antler. It happened at the speed of ordinary life. One winter, and then another. One litter, and then another. A slow sorting by what could bear closeness. Domestication, here, was not conquest. It was permission granted, and permission taken, a path worn by return. And the animals who could walk that path without fear were the ones who stayed. Those who stayed shaped a new kind of lineage. They were not chosen by humans in any deliberate sense. They chose themselves by daring to live at the threshold between species, and each time they endured, they carried forward the traits that allowed it. In this way, domestication was less an act than a sieve. The fearful fell away, generation after generation, while the steady remained. Slowly, the balance tilted. Calmness became common. Boldness no longer meant aggression, but the willingness to remain near. What was once exceptional became ordinary. The humans may not have understood the genetics behind it, but they recognized the difference. They saw which wolves bolted and which ones lingered. They knew which returned each season and which never came back. Familiarity grew into expectation. A figure pacing the edge of the firelight was no longer a surprise. It was part of the night. Over time, these wolves were not only scavengers. They were participants in the human world, however loosely. Their sense of timing matched the rhythms of camp life. They arrived when meals ended. They lay down when the fire grew quiet. They stirred when danger passed close. The flow of their behavior began to mirror the flow of the group. This mirroring deepened the bond, not consciously, not as alliance, but as rhythm layered upon rhythm. Humans were already used to moving as bands, watching each other, adjusting with small signals. Wolves lived the same way. So when their circles overlapped, the two patterns clicked into place. Archaeology reveals traces of this overlap. At some sites, wolf bones show signs of dietary change, wear patterns suggesting softer foods, more marrow, more fat. In others, canids appear buried near humans, their remains treated with care rather than discarded as waste. The evidence is fragmentary, but it points to lives lived close enough that the boundary between species blurred, and as that boundary softened, the wolves themselves changed. Not all at once, but in the curve of a skull, the size of a tooth, the way a pup played, rather than snapped. Their bodies were following the path their behavior had already begun. The animals who could walk among humans without panic were not only surviving, they were shaping the next generation. This was not domestication in the way we later understand it, with kennels and collars. It was domestication as drift, as filtering, as the quiet redirection of a wild lineage. No commands, no cages. Just the steady pressure of a new environment, one that rewarded patience and punished fear. And in that pressure, the wolf was becoming something else. Not yet dog, but not entirely wolf either. Something balanced between waiting for time to carry it further. That balance could not last forever. The environment itself would tilt it, slowly, steadily, until the creatures at the edge of the firelight no longer resembled those still roaming the wild hills. Selection was at work, not only through human tolerance, but through survival. A pup born too skittish would waste energy in flight, would miss a meal, would fail to thrive. A pup born calmer would remain, and in remaining, inherit the safety of the fire's glow. Across generations, the gap widened. At first, the differences were nearly invisible. a narrower snout, slightly smaller teeth, a posture that showed less tension when near humans. But over centuries, these subtle shifts added up. Each season reinforced the divide. On one side, wolves who still relied on their packs to hunt reindeer and bison across the frozen plain. On the other, wolves who lived on the margins of human life, who scavenged, waited, and adapted. The humans may not have spoken of it as change, but they lived it. To them, the wolves that stayed were simply familiar, the shapes in the dark that returned night after night, the ones who did not threaten, the ones who growled at intruders, who barked at the rustle of predators in the distance. Familiarity is its own kind of transformation, not in bone, but in perception. Over time, that perception became expectation. Children were raised knowing that some wolves were safe to watch, even to mimic in play. Adults grew used to their warnings. Camps formed with the quiet assumption that the watchers would appear. In this way, the presence of wolves became part of the architecture of human life. No longer external, not yet internal, but attached, and slowly, the line of inheritance carried these traits forward. Wolves that could not bear the closeness vanished from that niche. Wolves that could did more than survive. They passed their resilience, their tempered curiosity, to the next litter. Generation by generation, the drift became destiny. The archaeological record leaves faint traces of this shift. In sites across Europe, canid skulls diverge from wild norms. Their shapes foreshadow what would one day be called dogs, though at this stage they were still something in between. They were wolves, yes, but wolves shaped by a new force, coexistence. This is why the story is called quiet domestication. No one bent these creatures into service. No one forced their evolution. It was a mutual shaping, driven by proximity, by repetition, by the steady rhythm of nights survived together. The calmest remained, the calmest reproduced, and in time their descendants would carry not just the body of a wolf, but the temperament of a companion. The transformation had begun long before it was recognized, and once it started, it could not be undone. The quiet had already spoken, and the quiet left its mark, not only in behavior, but in earth. For there are places where this story did not vanish into smoke, but settled into soil, preserved by accident and time. Places where bones, both human and canine, lie side by side, telling us something words never could. That these animals had become more than watchers at the edge of firelight. They had become companions in life and in death. One of the most striking of these places is Bonfire Castle in modern Germany. 14,000 years ago, a man, a woman, and a dog were buried together in the same grave. The dog was young, no older than a year. Its skeleton shows signs of illness, a condition that would have made survival unlikely without care. Yet the bones also show that it lived for weeks while sick, supported not by its own strength, but by human hands. Someone had fed it, tended it, kept it alive until the illness claimed it, and then they buried it, not as waste, but as kin. What does this tell us? That by this late stage of the Ice Age, the bond had already deepened into something emotional, something costly. Food was scarce, every calorie counted. To feed a sick animal was not efficient. It was not logical in the calculus of survival. It was a choice driven by attachment, by the recognition that this creature's life had value beyond utility. The Bonfire Castle burial is not an isolated case. Across Europe and Asia, similar discoveries whisper the same truth. At Lineages in Russia, canid remains dating to around 15,000 years ago show dogs interred with care. In Israel, a burial at Ain Malaha, 12,000 years old, contains the skeleton of an elderly human cradling a puppy in their arms. These are not accidents. They are not the remains of refuse pits. They are deliberate placements, choices shaped by grief, reverence, and love. To place an animal in the ground alongside a human is to collapse the boundary between species. It says, this one belonged with us, this one carried meaning, this one mattered. The evidence also reveals the transition from wolf to dog had fully begun. The canids in these graves are smaller than wolves, their skulls reshaped, their teeth reduced. They carry the signs of domestication, not just in form, but in treatment. They were buried because they were different. Not wild beasts, not threats to be kept away, but companions who had earned a place within human society. The bonfire lit their nights. The burial sealed their bond. It is here, in these graves, that we see not just survival, but affection. The kind of affection that endures hunger, expends resources, and lingers in memory long after life has ended. Affection of this kind is difficult to measure, yet the soil preserves its outlines. Each grave with a dog inside it tells us not only about death, but about life, about the nights that came before, about the way these creatures were seen, touched, spoken to. For no burial happens in isolation. It follows bonds woven across days and seasons. At Bon Oberkassel, the care given to the sick animal shows more than tolerance. It shows dedication. Someone carried meat to its mouth when it could not hunt. Someone allowed it space in the shelter. Someone looked at it and decided to help. That act, repeated long enough, created a thread of attachment that did not break even after the animal's last breath. Instead, it was honoured with a grave. This suggests a relationship no longer bound only by utility. The dog was not just a hunter's tool or a sentry in the night. It was something closer to family. In a world where every scrap of fat was precious, the choice to feed a sick animal until death reflects an emotional investment far deeper than strategy. It reveals the stirrings of love, expressed not in words, but in action. Other burials echo this same theme. At Ein Malahar in Israel, the puppy placed in a human's arms speaks of tenderness. The bones reveal it was carefully positioned, not tossed or discarded. It was laid there with intention, as if to accompany the human into the next world. The gesture suggests the bond extended beyond survival into belief, into the realm of meaning that framed life and death. What we see across these sites is the transformation of wolves into more than domesticated animals. They had become companions of the spirit, beings whose presence was felt not only in the hunt, but in the imagination. Their value was not limited to food or protection. It touched the symbolic. They occupied space in ritual, in burial, in memory. Archaeologists debate whether these practices reflect early religious thought or simply affection. Perhaps it was both. Humans were creatures of meaning, always weaving stories to explain their world. The wolf that had once haunted their camps had become a creature of closeness. Its presence reshaped myth as well as life. Its burial alongside humans was both a testimony of love and a statement of identity. This being belongs with us. To bury together is to join futures. It is to say that in life, and in whatever comes after, we remain linked. The graves of dogs and humans are not only about what was lost, but about what was carried forward, the belief that this partnership was worth keeping, even beyond death. Carried forward, these burials speak to more than isolated acts. They mark a shift in how humans perceived the world around them. The animals at their side were no longer simply part of nature, to be feared or consumed. They had crossed into another category, one reserved for kin and companions. The grave made this clear. The soil drew a line between waste and reverence, and the dogs were placed on the side of reverence. What is remarkable is not just that this happened once, but that it happened across distant regions and cultures. From Germany to Russia to the Levant, people made the same decision. They did not discard these animals. They placed them with care, often near their own dead. That consistency points to a shared recognition, an understanding that crossed language and landscape. Wherever humans and dogs lived together, a new kind of attachment appeared. It is difficult to measure emotions across millennia, but actions speak. A burial takes effort. It consumes energy at a time when survival was already balanced on thin margins. Every act of digging into frozen ground, every piece of meat spared for a sick animal, every gesture of placing a body beside a human, all of this reflects intention. These choices carried weight because they were costly, and yet people made them anyway. The cost reveals the value. It is here that the bond between humans and dogs emerges not only as practical, but as emotional. The bond had crossed from necessity into meaning. Dogs were not buried because they were useful. They were buried because they were loved. because their presence mattered beyond their role, because their lives had become entangled with human lives so deeply that even death could not untangle them. These graves also invite us to see the continuity of care, to feed a sick dog until its final day, to cradle a puppy in the arms of the dead, to treat an animal's passing with the same gestures as a human's. These are acts that belong not only to logic, but to compassion. They suggest that by the end of the Ice Age, dogs had already become family, and in this we glimpse the earliest roots of the companionship that still endures today. The dog by the hearth, the dog at the bedside, the dog mourned at its passing. All of this began here, in those first quiet burials. The bonfire warmed the nights, but the graves revealed the heart. Together, they tell us that humans were no longer walking alone, for in honouring these animals in death, they revealed what had already been true in life, that the first friendship was not a convenience, it was a bond, and bonds, over time, leave their traces not only in memory but in bone. The wolves that lingered, the ones that fed from human scraps and slept closer to the fire, did not remain unchanged. Generation after generation, their bodies began to shift, carrying outward signs of the quiet transformation that had already taken root in their behaviour. The first changes were subtle: a shortening of the snout, a narrowing of the jaw, teeth that grew smaller, less suited to cracking heavy bone. To the eye of their human companions, these shifts may not have been obvious at first. A wolf was still a wolf, lean and sharp, eyes glowing in the dark. But over centuries, the differences became clearer. These were no longer the same creatures that hunted in wild packs beyond the tree line. Something was softening in them, in both form and spirit. Science now calls this phenomenon domestication syndrome. It describes the suite of traits that appear when animals adapt to human environments, often without direct breeding or force. Across species, the signs recur: shorter snouts, floppy ears, lighter coats, more frequent heat cycles, even piebald markings. They emerge not through design, but through the filtering of temperament. Calmer animals, more tolerant animals, pass on their gentler natures, and with those natures come physical changes, carried along as if temperament itself were reshaping the body. The fox domestication experiments of the 20th century revealed this clearly. Within only a few decades of selecting foxes for tameness, researchers saw dramatic results. The foxes wagged their tails, sought human contact, whined for attention, but their appearance shifted as well. Their coats grew mottled, their ears drooped, their skulls rounded. It was as though the pursuit of calmness rewrote the blueprint of their form. Something like this was unfolding thousands of years earlier among the wolves who chose human camps. The ones who tolerated closeness passed on their traits, and slowly, their descendants no longer carried the same wild sharpness. They began to look different. Archaeological finds give us glimpses of this transition. At Bonfire Castle, the dog buried with humans 14,000 years ago already bore the marks of domestication. Its skull shape diverged from the wolf standard. At other sites, canid remains show reduced tooth size, jaw changes, and evidence of smaller overall stature. These were not yet the wide variety of dogs we know today, but the direction was clear. Wolves were becoming dogs, even before humans had words for the distinction, and for the people who lived with them, these changes mattered. A face less fierce, a body more approachable, an animal that looked familiar not only in behaviour, but in form. The difference was not merely practical, it was emotional. To look into the eyes of a creature that seemed gentler, rounder, softer, was to see not just a predator, but a partner. And once those faces began to change, the relationship changed with them. Partnership deepened as appearance shifted. The wolves that once looked nearly identical to their wild cousins were beginning to carry signals of difference, signals humans could recognize at a glance. The change was not sudden, nor was it total. For generations, wild packs and camp followers still mingled on the edges of the steppe. Yet slowly, certain animals looked less like wolves, and more like something else, something becoming dog. Coats carried the first hints. Where once the uniform grey and tawny shades of wolves prevailed, new patterns began to emerge. Lighter fur, mottled spots, patches of white or black. Piebald markings, common across domesticated animals, became more frequent. A splash of pale fur across a face, a streak along a flank. These small variations made the animal stand out, and humans remembered them. A creature distinguished by markings was easier to identify, easier to recognize as the same individual returning each night. Memory reinforced attachment. Tails also told the story. Over time, some curled slightly upward, a shape rarely seen in wild wolves. Ears too began to soften in certain lines, tilting or drooping in ways that signaled something had shifted in the architecture of bone and cartilage. These were not dramatic changes all at once, but slow signatures of domestication's hand. The body, responding to the selection of temperament, followed where behavior had already led. Scientists believe these traits appear because the same genes that regulate tameness influence physical development. When fear pathways are suppressed, hormones shift. When stress is less constant, the body develops differently. The result is a cascade of small changes that ripple outward. A shorter muzzle, altered coats, rounder skulls. Across many domesticated species, the same suite of traits repeats. Rabbits, pigs, foxes, dogs, different lineages, the same logic. For humans of the Upper Paleolithic, the science was invisible, but the outcome was plain. The animals beside them looked friendlier, if only by the softness of a muzzle or the gentleness of an eye. They still carried teeth, still bore the strength of predators, but their faces spoke of something more approachable, something less wild. This mattered deeply in a world where relationships with animals had always been defined by caution. A rounded snout, a mottled coat, a tail that wagged rather than bristled. These cues reshaped human perception. They made the animals easier to accept, easier to trust, easier to invite closer to the circle of fire. And trust built upon trust. A pup with a softer look was more likely to be kept near. A pup that tolerated children was more likely to be fed. These choices, repeated across generations, reinforced the same pathway that nature had already opened. Selection favored the calmest, and with them came the faces that looked different. The wolves were no longer only wolves. They were becoming a new form entirely, not only by behavior, not only by presence, but by the very shape of their bodies, which told the story of change more clearly than words ever could. That story, written into bone and fur, was one that humans could not ignore. A creature that once resembled every other wolf in the wilderness was now distinguishable by its features. The differences were small at first, but each carried meaning. A face more open, a coat patterned in ways that invited recognition, a body that seemed less severe, more approachable. These changes altered how humans responded, and in turn how the animals themselves survived. Recognition was powerful. To know one wolf dog from another was to begin seeing them as individuals, not as interchangeable predators. Children named them. Hunters pointed them out by their markings. Elders remembered the ones who returned, season after season, and told stories of their endurance. These stories bound the animals more tightly to human life than any rope ever could. The process fed itself. A wolf dog tolerated the camp. Humans tolerated the wolf dog. Attachment formed, not because it was demanded, but because the animal's very appearance seemed to invite it. The softer face, the wagging tail, the mottled coat, all of these became signals of safety. They lowered barriers of fear. They encouraged humans to step closer, to extend food, to allow a pup to sleep by the fire. Domestication syndrome had reshaped the body, but in doing so, it reshaped the bond. People saw less of the predator and more of the partner. The animal that once bristled in the night now wagged its tail at dawn. The animal that once blended with the forest now carried a splash of white that made it stand out in the camp. These differences may have been accidental, but they carried immense symbolic weight. Archaeological remains confirm the spread of these traits. At sites across Europe, early dog skulls show reduced size and shortened snouts compared to wolves. Their teeth, while still sharp, were less robust. Their skeletons were lighter. Some carried the first hints of variation in coat and body shape that would, in millennia to come, blossom into hundreds of breeds. But in this early stage, the message was simpler. The wolves were becoming dogs, and the transformation could be seen. What began as a subtle divergence became a visible reality. The watchers at the fire's edge were no longer indistinguishable from their wild kin. They were recognizably different, both in form and in function. They guarded, they warned, they followed, they stayed. And in staying, they became something the world had never seen before. A new species shaped not by force, but by companionship. A creature whose face carried both the shadow of the wolf and the imprint of human closeness. A creature whose body told the story of patience, repetition, and shared survival. The faces were changing. The bond was deepening. And step by step, feature by feature, the first true dogs had begun to appear. And with the new faces came new roles. The animals that lingered were no longer only shapes at the fire's edge or companions in burial. They began to move beside the people, not just in camp, but across the wide plains where life was won and lost. This was where the bond truly proved itself. In the hunt. For Paleolithic humans, the hunt was endurance made visible. They lacked the speed of lions, the claws of bears, the sheer power of mammoths. What they had was patience. They could track across frozen rivers and open grasslands, following the faintest signs. A bent blade of grass, a print half hidden by snow, the distant call of birds disturbed by movement. And when the chase began, they relied on a strategy few other predators possessed: persistence hunting. The ability to run, not faster, but longer, until the prey collapsed in exhaustion. Wolves lived by a similar strategy. Their packs worked as one, scattering across the land, wearing down reindeer or bison with relentless pursuit. They did not strike with speed alone. They waited for weakness to show. They tested the herd, prodded it, found the animal that faltered, and then, together, they pressed the chase until the quarry fell. It is here, in this shared endurance, that the two species found their deepest alignment. Imagine the scene: a small band of humans moving across the Mammoth Steppe at dawn, their breath rising in the cold. Ahead of them, a set of prints drifts through the snow, wide and heavy. A reindeer herd has passed. Alongside the humans move the dog-like wolves, ears pricked, noses low, reading the world in scents invisible to the human eye. Where the humans see a faint depression in the snow, the wolves smell the animal itself, fresh and near. Where the humans falter, the wolves press forward, drawn by instinct as old as their blood. The cooperation was not planned. It was not commanded. It was parallel effort, slowly bending toward partnership. Humans drove the prey with shouts and spears. Wolves circled, cutting escape routes, harrying the flanks. What began as chance became repetition, and repetition bred expectation. The humans came to look for the wolves. The wolves came to follow the humans. Each found in the other a force that multiplied their own. Archaeological sites provide echoes of this union. Piles of bones show butchery at a scale unlikely to have been achieved by humans alone. Scavenging wolves could have arrived after the fact, but the pattern suggests something more. A rhythm of cooperation, loose but real, where both sides gained. Humans secured meat, fat, and hide. Wolves gained marrow, scraps, and safety. Both survived. It was in the hunt, more than anywhere else, that the partnership deepened. The fires had brought them close. The burials had honoured the bond. But in the chase across endless plains, humans and wolves discovered what they could truly do together. Together, they pressed the chase. Humans leaned on sight, following tracks etched faintly into snow or mud. Wolves leaned on scent, a trail so vivid to them, it was as though the prey itself still lingered. Each species extended the senses of the other, creating a combined awareness far greater than either could hold alone. What one missed, the other supplied. What one weakened, the other pursued. This partnership thrived because it was built upon endurance. Humans had lungs and sweat glands designed for long pursuit, able to shed heat while running for hours. Wolves, too, were masters of distance. Their bodies were made to lope endlessly, conserving energy across miles until prey faltered. Few creatures on Earth could withstand such pressure from both sides. Herd animals that escaped a wolf pack might still collapse under the relentless tracking of humans. Animals that slipped past human hunters could still be harried by wolves. Survival for the quarry became nearly impossible. The scene may have looked chaotic. Humans shouting, throwing spears, wolves darting at the flanks of prey. Yet beneath that noise was a structure. Humans forced the herd into confusion. Wolves exploited the breaks. And when exhaustion finally overcame the animal, the kill was shared. Humans took the choicest cuts, the fat and organs. Wolves gnawed bones, cracked joints, scavenged what was left. Neither species gained everything, but both gained enough. Some evidence hints that this cooperation was not entirely unplanned. At hunting sites where reindeer bones lie in vast quantities, the butchery patterns suggest systematic effort. To bring down such numbers required coordination beyond small bands of people alone. Wolves at the edges may have been integral, not by command, but by instinct aligning with human strategy. Their participation shaped the outcome. Even if no one acknowledged it as partnership, the more it happened, the more predictable it became. Wolves began to follow humans not only for scraps, but for opportunity. Humans began to expect wolves not only as scavengers, but as hunters in their own right. Each species adjusted. The relationship was not one-sided. It was reciprocal, even if uneven. Both gained, both endured. Endurance mattered not only in the chase, but in the carrying. After a kill, meat had to be transported back to camp. For humans, this was laborious, a burden stretched across distance. Wolves, with their jaws and stamina, may have trailed along, carrying bones and scraps, ensuring nothing went to waste. What was left behind became their share, and in this way, the circle of benefit widened. It is in this cooperation that trust deepened. Trust not as affection, but as reliance. The humans learned to count on the wolves to be there, to help close the gap, to guard the kill while the meat was prepared. The wolves, in turn, learned to count on the humans to make the hunt more successful, to leave behind enough to justify the risk of staying near. The hunt was no longer solitary, it was shared. Shared hunts reshaped not only survival, but identity. For humans, the presence of wolves at their side altered how they imagined the world. No longer were they alone in the role of endurance hunters. Another species mirrored their strengths, doubling their reach. For wolves, the camps of humans became extensions of their own packs. The lines blurred. Two predators that once competed now moved through the same landscape with overlapping strategies. This alignment was not without tension. A wolf could still turn on a human could still strike a wolf that came too close. Yet the pattern endured. The benefits outweighed the risks. Over generations, repetition carved the partnership into something stable, a habit embedded in both memory and instinct. Endurance was the glue. Humans, with their ability to run prey to collapse, and wolves, with their unmatched noses and teamwork, formed a hunting machine that few environments could resist. The Mammoth Steppe, with its vast distances and herds, favoured such cooperation. A reindeer that might escape a wolf pack alone had little chance when human persistence joined the chase. A bison that might outlast a group of humans fell more quickly when wolves harried its sides. The overlap of strategies made survival more certain. Archaeological echoes suggest this partnership. In some sites, the remains of prey animals appear in volumes beyond what small groups of humans should have managed. Cut marks on bones show deliberate butchery, while gnaw marks reveal that canids also fed from the kill. This dual signature is evidence of cooperation, even if unspoken. The hunt ended with both species eating. That was enough. Over time, this cooperation moved beyond opportunism. The wolves that stayed close became more reliable. Their offspring grew up alongside human bands, accustomed to firelight and noise. Pups raised in this environment learned quickly that the humans were not enemies. They became the animals who followed willingly, who circled during the hunt, who waited at the edges of the camp when the work was done. The cycle reinforced itself. The humans allowed them. The wolves returned, and trust, once fragile, solidified. The hunt became more than pursuit. It became ritual. Humans rose with the dawn, gathered their tools, followed the tracks. Wolves fell into step, moving ahead, scanning the wind, listening for the faintest signs. Each species knew its role, though no one had agreed to it. It was not command. It was rhythm, shaped by repetition and time. And when the chase ended, when blood soaked the snow and breath steamed in the cold air, the two species stood together over what they had brought down. The humans carved, the wolves tore. The spoils were divided not evenly, but predictably. And predictability itself was the foundation of trust. What began as chance was now necessity. Neither species would return fully to life without the other. They had discovered something rare, a partnership of predators built on endurance, sharpened by hunger, and sealed in the long rhythm of the chase. And when the chase ended, night always followed. The kill was butchered, the meat roasted, the hides stretched across frames. Firelight flickered against bone and ash. Beyond the glow, shadows shifted. The wolves that had run with the people now lay at the edges of camp, their bodies curled against the cold. It was in these hours, not the hunt, that the deepest changes began to take root. The Ice Age night was long. Bitter winds pressed against hide shelters. Frost crept into lungs and froze the edges of breath. For humans, warmth was survival. They huddled together, layered in furs, pressed close to embers. Yet even with fire, the cold seeped in. It was relentless, searching for cracks. And so every source of warmth mattered. Wolves carried warmth too. Thick coats, bodies radiating heat. At first, they must have slept apart, cautious, alert, ready to bolt. But the edges of distance shrank. A wolf settled just beyond the fire. Another dared to lie closer, its flank catching the glow of embers. And someone allowed it. A child leaned against fur and did not cry. A mother saw and did not shout. These were small acts, but they carried weight. In the silent hours of the night, they spoke of acceptance. This was companionship before the word existed. Not a tool, not a guard, not a hunter. Simply a body near another body. Shared warmth in the heart of winter. Archaeological evidence hints at this intimacy. Burials like those at Bon Ober Castle and Ein Malaha suggest more than utility. They suggest closeness, the kind born in quiet hours beside the fire. The bones are not only markers of death, but shadows of life lived together. Wolves that had ceased to be only wolves, their presence woven into human comfort and grief. The emotional shift was subtle but profound. To allow another species into the sleeping circle was to redefine the boundary of trust. Sleep is the deepest vulnerability. To close one's eyes and rest near another predator was unthinkable in the wild. Yet here it was happening. Trust had advanced beyond the hunt. It had reached the hearth. The fire warmed the skin. The wolf warmed the heart. Both together softened fear, and in that softening, a bond deeper than survival began to form. This was the beginning of something that would endure through millennia. Long before collars, long before leashes, long before the word dog, there was only the fire, and the choice to sleep beside it, together. That was fragile at first. The wolves did not press too close. The humans did not fully relax. A space always remained, measured in trust and in caution. Yet night after night the line blurred. One wolf stretched nearer to the warmth. A human child reached out, fingers tangling in fur. A spark of fear rose, then passed, and nothing broke. That absence of violence was itself a lesson. Each quiet night reinforced the possibility of peace. The value of such nearness went beyond comfort. It was protection. A wolf that stirred in the dark could wake the camp before danger arrived. A low growl was an alarm more sensitive than any human ear. To sleep near wolves was to sleep more deeply, with vigilance distributed. The camp rested easier, knowing watchful eyes remained open even when theirs were shut. And then there was the warmth. The Ice Age was merciless. Even with fire and furs, the cold gnawed at bone. A living body beside you made the difference between shivering through the night and waking restored. To share that warmth with an animal was to extend the circle of survival. It was not sentiment at first, it was pragmatism. Yet pragmatism, repeated across generations, often grows into something greater. This is where emotion began to creep in. Bonds forged in necessity deepened into bonds of attachment. To stroke the flank of a wolf and feel it steady, its breath was to glimpse something familiar. Care, comfort, kinship. The humans had already known such feelings within their own groups. Now they were extending them outward, across the boundary of species, across the ancient divide of predator and prey. Evidence of this shift is written in burial sites, where humans and dogs rest together. The act of placing them side by side in death reflects a closeness first lived in life. It is not hard to imagine how that closeness began. In the hush of the night, around firelight, when silence and warmth bound them together, trust was not absolute. It could not be. A startled bite was always possible. A fearful shout could still break the peace. But the longer they shared the fire, the stronger the habit of acceptance grew. And habits are the architecture of change. Once the presence of wolves became ordinary, once the idea of sleeping with them was no longer strange, the future of the bond was secured. From warmth grew familiarity. From familiarity grew affection. And affection, once planted, rarely fades. It lingers, reshaping perception, until the animal at your side is no longer just a wolf. It is something more, a being with which your life is entangled, a companion of the fire. The animal at the fire's edge was no longer simply tolerated. Its place there was becoming assumed. With each passing season the strangeness faded, until the presence of wolves near sleeping humans felt ordinary. What once would have been unthinkable was now woven into the rhythm of daily life. And in that ordinariness, affection deepened. People began to see these creatures not only as guardians or sources of warmth, but as companions. Their nearness carried comfort. Their steady breathing in the dark softened the sharp edge of fear. Their willingness to stay through the coldest nights suggested something more than hunger. It suggested a willingness to belong. Archaeological evidence whispers of this closeness. At sites like Ein Malahar and Bon Oberkassel, dogs and humans were buried together, the animals treated not as objects, but as kin. Such gestures point to an emotional bond already well established. The graves show what the fire first revealed, that these beings had crossed the invisible line between predator and partner. What is remarkable is how simple the beginning must have been. A child reaching out to touch fur. A wolf resting its head near a human's feet. A moment of stillness in which neither pulled away. These fleeting encounters carried weight because they were remembered and repeated. Each repetition built the expectation that peace was possible, that closeness could endure. The fire itself became the stage for this transformation. It was the shared centre, the place where food was cooked, stories were told, and nights were endured. To allow another species to join that circle was to invite it into the heart of human life. Around the fire, humans defined who they were. Around the fire, wolves began to be included in that definition. Of course, not all encounters ended in harmony. A wrong move could break the fragile trust. A fearful bite, a harsh shout, a clash of instincts could undo weeks of quiet progress. Yet the fact that the pattern persisted across generations and across continents shows how resilient it was. The advantages of sleeping near wolves outweighed the risks. Safety, warmth, and companionship pulled the two species together despite the dangers. Over time, the fire was no longer only a human possession. It was shared, if not in ownership, then in presence. Wolves lay closer, humans reached farther, and the boundary between them blurred. The darkness outside the glow remained dangerous, but within the circle of light, a new kind of belonging had taken shape. This was the emotional heart of domestication. Not the hunt, not the scraps, not even the burial, but the night itself, when humans and wolves closed their eyes under the same light and allowed themselves to rest. It was here, in the stillness between flames and breath, that they became more than allies. They became companions of the fire. In the glow of that companionship, the smallest among them often became the first to cross the remaining distance. Children carried a softness that adults, hardened by hunger and danger, often did not. Their laughter, their play, their clumsy hands reaching without threat, created opportunities no strategy could plan. And at the edge of the firelight, pups mirrored that same openness. Young wolves, like young humans, were explorers. They tested boundaries, they stumbled into mistakes and were forgiven for them. They chased, they tumbled, they gnawed. Their curiosity, untempered by fear, made them bold in ways adults would never dare. It is not difficult to imagine the two finding each other in the space between caution and innocence. A child tossing a bone, a pup darting forward to snatch it, a game begun not by command but by impulse. These small gestures mattered. They stripped away the sharpness that defined interactions between adults. Where a man saw a threat, a boy saw a playmate. Where a wolf growled at a spear, a pup wagged at a stick. In this mirroring, something new formed. Bonds created not through calculation, but through joy. Archaeologists point to hints of this in the record. At Ain Malaha, the burial of a human with a puppy in their arms suggests not just utility, but affection. Such closeness likely grew in childhood, when boundaries were more fluid. A puppy in the arms of a child, nurtured and fed, could grow into an animal that trusted humans more than it feared them, and that animal, in turn, raised litters already accustomed to human scent, human sound, human presence. Play was the bridge. It required no language, no tools, no planning. It was instinctive, arising naturally when two young beings encountered each other. Both species shared the same impulses: chase, wrestle, chew, run. These games trained muscles and sharpened skills, but they also built familiarity. A pup that played with a child learned that humans were not always dangerous. A child that played with a pup learned that not all wolves were to be feared. This was not a single event. It was a pattern repeated countless times across countless camps, and each time it happened, it reinforced the pathway of domestication. The calmest pups approached children. The most curious children welcomed pups. Their laughter, their patience, their fearlessness created space for something adults might never have dared to attempt. Slowly, through games and shared curiosity, trust seeped into the fabric of daily life, and in those playful encounters, the bond of species grew stronger than hunger, stronger than caution. The child and the pup discovered what the adult and the wolf could not. That companionship could be born not only from need, but from joy. Children brought a brightness into the camps that adults often could not. Even in bitter cold, they played with sticks, splashed in puddles, and turned scraps into toys. This instinct for play mirrored the behavior of wolf pups, whose energy and curiosity carried the same rhythm. When the two met, their movements aligned with ease. Chase, tumble, tug, a language of bodies that needed no words. It was in these shared games that fear began to dissolve. A child would toss a bone, and a pup would dash after it, returning with a playful growl. Another would tug at a scrap of hide, only to find the pup tugging back. Adults watched with guarded eyes, yet they could not miss what was unfolding. The teeth that threatened in adults seemed muted in the young. The growl softened into play, the pounce into clumsy affection. What happened between children and pups mattered because it built trust at the most vulnerable stage of life. A child who grew up playing with pups would carry those memories into adulthood. A pup raised among children would mature accustomed to the scent and sound of humans. Together they created a foundation that reached beyond their own lifetimes, shaping generations to come. Archaeology offers quiet echoes of this relationship. At Ain Malaha, a puppy was buried in the arms of a human. The posture suggests not just practicality, but tenderness, a bond woven in everyday moments that became important enough to preserve in death. Burials like this likely stemmed from bonds first formed in play. The relationship benefited both sides. Children found companionship in the pups, who were small enough to be less threatening and eager enough to join their games. Pups found safety, food, and acceptance in the children's company. The lessons learned in these moments shaped behavior. Children learned gentleness, patience, and the ability to read animal signals. Pups learned restraint, tolerance, and the rhythms of human life. Each repetition made the bond stronger. A pup that played gently was kept near the camp. A child that returned again and again to those games grew up with less fear of wolves. Slowly, behavior shifted on both sides. The line between species softened into familiarity. Adults began to notice the benefits. The pups that had grown up alongside children were calmer when grown. They were less likely to flee, less likely to bite. They were already halfway to becoming something new. And so, what had begun in innocence became a tool of transformation. The bond between children and pups became a quiet engine, carrying the story of domestication forward. That story unfolded in ways both subtle and profound. The games of youth were more than distractions. They became the quiet bridges that allowed two species to step closer to one another. Without the innocence of children and the openness of pups, the distance might never have closed so easily. The strength of this connection lay in repetition. Each season brought new children into the camp, and each litter brought new pups to the edge of the firelight. The cycle renewed itself over and over, with bonds forming before fear had time to harden. What adults hesitated to allow, the young created naturally. They did not ask if the animal was useful. They did not weigh the risks with careful caution. They simply reached out, and often the pups reached back. In these simple gestures, entire lineages were shaped. Pups accustomed to play became adults who tolerated human presence. Their young inherited those temperaments, carrying the process further. Humans, too, carried their memories into adulthood. Those who had played with pups as children grew into adults, less fearful, more willing to feed, more willing to accept the watchers at the edge of the camp. The circle of trust widened across generations. Archaeological finds confirm that by the late Pleistocene, some canids were already distinct from wolves. Smaller skulls, reduced teeth, lighter frames. These were not just wild wolves tolerated for a time. They were the first steps toward dogs, born of repeated interactions that had their roots in the games between the young. The emotional impact is harder to trace, yet perhaps more significant. The first laughter shared with a pup, the first comfort found in its warmth, the first grief when one was lost, these moments left no fossils. But they lingered in behavior, in story, in the shaping of culture. They were remembered, not in stone tools or carvings, but in habits passed forward like fire itself. For humans, the presence of an animal that could join in play changed what companionship meant. No longer confined to their own kind, they now found connection in another species. For wolves, the presence of a child who did not strike or chase changed what safety meant. No longer confined to their own packs, they now found belonging in human bands. Together, the child and the pup revealed a truth adults had overlooked. Trust could be born not only of hunger or survival, but of affection, and affection, once discovered, could not easily be undone. By the time night fell and the fires burned low, the memory of the day's games lingered. Children dreamed of the pups that had run beside them. Pups dreamed of the children who had fed them. In those dreams, as in waking life, the distance between species was already closing. It was in these early friendships, fragile yet joyful, that the foundations of partnership were laid. Those foundations were not built with speech. They rested instead on the quiet exchange of signals, the kind both species were already equipped to read. Long before words existed, humans and wolves shared an ability that made understanding possible, the ability to notice. A tilt of the head, a stiffening of shoulders, a growl deep in the chest. These were messages that needed no vocabulary. For wolves, survival depended on such precision. A pack hunted not by orders but by watching each other's movements, by adjusting in response to the flick of a tail or the angle of an ear. Cohesion was born from attention. Humans, too, relied on silent cues. In the hunt, a raised hand could halt a group. A shift in gaze could guide attention to distant prey. In the camp, Expressions carried meaning even without sound. The slightest tremor of fear on a face, the tightening of lips before laughter, the lift of an eyebrow, all of it was read and understood. This parallel sensitivity created a bridge. Wolves and humans did not need shared words to share intentions. They only needed to look. They only needed to listen. A human pointing toward movement in the dark carried meaning for the wolves, who followed the gesture with their eyes. A wolf bristling at the edge of the fire alerted the humans without a sound. Each species extended the other's senses, not through language, but through recognition. Archaeologists and ethologists suggest this capacity for mutual reading was one of the earliest pillars of domestication. It was not enough to linger near the fire or to play as pups and children did. To live together, each side had to trust the signals of the other. And over time, those signals became clearer. Perhaps a hunter learned that when a certain wolf's ears pricked forward, prey was near. Perhaps a wolf learned that when a certain human's body tensed, danger approached. These observations became habits. Habits became expectations. And expectations became communication. The remarkable thing is that none of this required words. It was language carried in posture, in rhythm, in breath. It was a conversation spoken through bodies rather than tongues. Even today, when dogs tilt their heads to human voices or follow the direction of a pointing finger, they are practicing skills thousands of years old. The partnership between species grew stronger because both already knew how to listen without words. Both had been trained by survival to notice the smallest of signs. And when two such creatures began to live side by side, silence was not a barrier. It was the beginning of understanding. That understanding grew in the smallest of ways. A wolf, standing motionless at the tree line, signaled more than presence, it carried intent. A human glancing quickly toward the same shadows confirmed that the message was received. No words passed, but both reacted. Over and over, these exchanges layered into trust. Trust deepened, because both species had long histories of cooperation within their own kind. Wolves thrived in packs precisely because they could predict one another's actions. Humans survived in bands because they too relied on unspoken cues. When these two systems overlapped, the recognition was immediate. They were already fluent in a language of glances and gestures. Children noticed it first. A pup crouched low, tail wagging, eyes wide, invited a game without sound. A child mirrored the movement and joined. Adults followed with subtler signals. A hunter crouching in tall grass found a wolf lowering itself beside him. The message was shared. Wait. Be still. Watch. In such moments, silence became a tool rather than a gap. The night was thick with danger. Loud speech could give away a camp's position or startle prey too soon. Quiet communication was safer. Wolves were already masters of it. Humans had long practiced it. Together, they became even more skilled. Research in modern ethology shows how unusual this ability is. Many animals cannot follow a human's pointing finger, yet dogs can. They understand not only the gesture, but the intention behind it. This trait likely emerged from those Ice Age encounters when wolves that could best read human signals thrived. Over generations, selection rewarded mutual comprehension. Archaeological finds support the story. In early dog remains, changes to skull shape may have influenced facial expressions, making them easier for humans to read. Similarly, humans may have unconsciously selected animals whose gaze lingered, whose eyes followed, whose bodies carried meaning that was easier to interpret. The result was not just a tamer wolf, but one that seemed to speak without speaking. The partnership was therefore reinforced by something deeper than shared space. It was reinforced by shared attention. Both species paid close heed to each other, and in that attentiveness, a bond emerged. When a wolf growled softly, the camp stirred. When a human pointed into the dusk, the wolves followed. These gestures saved lives, led hunts, and smoothed coexistence. And every time the message was clear, the bond of trust thickened. What began as chance became expectation. What began as silence became dialogue. Not with words, but with movement and intent. The fires of the Ice Age illuminated not only faces, but the first sparks of a language that needed no speech. Those sparks glowed brighter with every generation that followed. As wolves and humans lived closer together, their capacity to read each other deepened until it became second nature. What had once been remarkable became ordinary. A glance was enough. A gesture sufficed. Both sides understood. This silent exchange changed the rhythm of daily life. At the hunt, wolves did not wait for commands. They moved when the hunters moved, stopped when the hunters stopped. In the camp, humans reacted instinctively to the pricking of ears or the lift of a muzzle. They trusted the wolves to sense what they could not. Wolves, in turn, trusted humans to respond. Such trust required more than instinct. It demanded memory. A wolf that signaled and was ignored might never bother again, but when the message was acknowledged, reinforced, rewarded, the habit grew stronger. The same was true for humans. A gesture met with cooperation encouraged them to gesture again. Layer upon layer, the dialogue took shape. Modern studies hint at how far this ability reached. Dogs not only follow pointing hands, they also read human emotions through tone and expression. A raised eyebrow, a softening of voice, a smile. These cues, trivial to us, are powerful to them. The seeds of that talent were planted in the Ice Age, when wolves and humans first began to treat each other's faces as meaningful texts. It is likely that this communication was uneven, sometimes failing, sometimes breaking into confusion. A wolf that growled in warning could still be mistaken for aggression. A human's sudden movement might trigger flight. Yet the sheer number of successful exchanges outweighed the failures. Survival rewarded clarity, and clarity grew with practice. Around the fire, where words drifted into the air but gestures anchored meaning, this bond found its deepest ground. The wolves that lay closest did not need to be spoken to. They only needed to be watched. A slow blink, a softened posture, a stretch toward the warmth. These movements spoke of calm. Humans mirrored them, settling in turn. In this way, both species taught each other how to signal peace. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Language in any form is not only about sharing information, it is about shaping trust. Each clear signal reduced uncertainty. Each reduced uncertainty created space for cooperation. And cooperation, repeated across thousands of years, transformed wolves into something new. What had begun as silent observation had become communication. What had begun as cautious watching had become dialogue. This was the groundwork on which all later companionship rested. Before the leash, before the collar, before even the word dog, there was a language without words, spoken in glances, carried in posture, heard in the silence between fire and dark. And when morning returned, the silence gave way to motion. A rustle of hide, a footfall on frost, a quiet breath drawn through cold air. The fire had shrunk to coals, but the memory of warmth moved with them, folded inside bark and ash, carried like a promise to the next place. Nothing stayed. Not the shelters, not the paths, not even the outlines of yesterday's footprints. The world changed shape each night. Ice shifted, winds redrew the valleys, herds moved, and people moved with them. Some of the wolves, the ones that had watched from the edges, rose too. Not all. A few turned back toward forest and kin, chasing smells older than fire. But others chose to follow not out of need, not from command, but as if drawn forward by the same invisible thread that pulled the humans on. There was no ceremony in it, no signal given, just bodies falling into rhythm, the crunch of snow, the creak of bundled furs, the soft pads of paws finding space between boots and dragging sleds. Children glanced back and were not surprised to see yellow eyes and lifted ears. Adults did not speak of it, but they noticed. When the trail grew steep, when the wind came too hard across the plain, the presence of those quiet companions became something more than familiar. It became expected. The journey itself was the forge. It tested what the fire had formed. To travel meant hunger, fatigue, danger. It meant watching the sky and reading the ground. It meant moving before the world closed behind you. And still they followed. They moved not as prey, not as watchers waiting for scraps, but as something new. Not quite wild, not quite tame. They moved because the camp had moved. Because what had been shared around the fire could now be shared on the road. The long walk became a ritual of its own. Each day began not with speech, but with movement. A quiet gathering of bundles. A last scan of the site to leave nothing behind but footprints and ash. The line of travellers stretched out slowly, bodies hunched against wind or warmed by early light. Ahead, the land waited not welcoming, but familiar in its indifference. The wolves ranged along the flanks. Sometimes they disappeared for hours, only to reappear at the edge of sight, as if they too had circled the camp and counted its people. The humans did not command them, but their presence mattered. A sudden turn of the head, a raised nose, a quick dart into brush, these were signs. Read, remembered, trusted. Somewhere between watcher and companion, the wolves had learned the rhythm of migration. They no longer circled only for scraps. They rested when the people rested. They rose when the load-bearing shoulders began to rise. At river crossings they paced along the banks, alert. At night they curled close to the sleeping bodies, not as invaders, but as part of the circle. This partnership was not equal, but it was mutual. The people carried the fire, the tools, the children. The wolves carried senses honed by wildness, a nose that could smell the difference between silence and threat, ears that could sort wind from whisper. Each brought something the other lacked, and when survival depended on timing, on knowing before seeing, those gifts were shared without question. Archaeological traces tell of this movement. Sites across Eurasia reveal paths that stretch far beyond the seasonal range of a single pack. Bones of wolves and proto-dogs appear not just at camp centres, but alongside human refuse, near fire pits, sometimes inside shelters. Their paws walked the same ground, their bodies faced the same storms, and yet not all followed. Some wolves remained behind, returning to the wild, uninterested or unwilling to stay tethered to humans. The bond, still new, had no guarantees. But for those who stayed close, who matched their pace to the walking bands, something irreversible was taking root. It was not domestication by force. No leash bound them to the group. No fence kept them in. It was domestication by choice, repeated every morning that feet and paws moved in the same direction, every day that ended with firelight and shared nearness. The humans might not have seen it yet. To them, it was still a presence at the edge, a benefit perhaps, a pattern, but not a promise. Not yet. The wolves, too, lived in the moment. They hunted, watched, rested, returned, but each time they followed, the path ahead grew less solitary, and each step forward pressed the story a little deeper into the earth. Earth remembered the weight of passage. Along ancient trails, faint depressions in the soil marked the routes worn by countless migrations. Human footprints mingled with paw prints, sometimes overlaid, sometimes side by side. Wind erased the surface, but below, layers of compacted ground held quiet records of companionship. The fire, though small, bound those journeys together. Each night it was built again, not always in the same shape, not always in the same place, but always at the centre of something shared. Around it, the camp reassembled. Children curled against sleeping hides. Elders leaned into warmth. And in that ring of flickering shadows, the watchers took their place. They did not need instruction. When the fire came to life, they came closer. Not to beg, not to challenge, but to settle, to belong. The same way they rose when the bundles tightened and the trail called. No signal, no need for speech. They moved as if they understood that this life, this moving life, was theirs now too. It was not just the wolves who were changing. People changed in response. Hands reached out more often. Scraps were offered not just from utility but from habit. Children called to the animals without fear. Some even named them. Not in our words, but in theirs, sounds drawn from breath and laughter, markings of familiarity. And the wolves began to look different. Those who stayed with humans, who raised their pups near fires, slowly diverged from their wild kin. Shorter muzzles, softer eyes, tails that curled slightly in rest. These changes would take generations to shape, but the first outlines were already visible. The wild was still present in them, but something new had begun to show. That newness was not only in the body, but in behavior. These animals learned not just to tolerate human presence, but to anticipate it. They moved where people moved, waited when people waited, rested near children, walked behind hunters, growled only when something beyond the dark moved wrong. In time, their presence became part of the group's sense of safety. A wolf who stirred in the night could wake a sleeping camp before danger arrived. A wolf who vanished might be noticed sooner than a missing person. Without planning, without roles, the wolves had begun to serve the group. And the group, though still hesitant to name them as such, had begun to see them as theirs. There were still limits. They were not pets. They were not possessions. They were still other. But not entirely. Not anymore. As the camp lifted again, as fire became ash, and the path stretched forward, the wolves followed. Not at the centre, not at the front, but always close enough to be counted. And wherever they stopped next, the fire would be built. And around it, the same eyes would gleam in the dark, watching, waiting, choosing still to stay. Some did not stay. Or if they did, their stories did not endure in the bloodlines we know. They walked the same paths, slept near the same fires, followed the same people through snow and wind and open plain. But somewhere along the way, their line vanished. Not every partnership leaves a descendant. Some end without passing forward what they carried. The ashes of an extinguished fire, a name forgotten, a bloodline lost not through failure, but through silence. Modern science tells us what memory cannot. In ancient bones unearthed beneath layers of loam and time, fragments of DNA, whisper of dogs we no longer have, lineages that shared life with humans for centuries, sometimes millennia, and then disappeared. Their shapes may have resembled the wolves beside them. Their behaviours may have mirrored the tameness we know. But their blood runs nowhere in the dogs we live with now. The story is not a single thread. It is a braid of many strands, some that snapped early, some that fused, others that twisted into the roots of modern breeds. Genetic analysis of canid remains from Europe, Siberia, and the Middle East has revealed something unexpected. Domestication did not happen only once. It happened several times, in different places, at different moments, and not all of those beginnings survived. Some of the earliest candidates for domestication may have lived 15 or even 20,000 years ago. Their bones show signs of proximity to humans, changed skull shapes, reduced aggression, patterns of wear and injury that suggest lives spent alongside, not apart. But when compared to the genetic lines of modern dogs, many of these traces go nowhere. They are dead ends in the family tree. The wolves that chose to follow, to linger, to trust they were not all ancestors. Some were kin to no one, companions of the moment. They gave and received warmth, protection, meat, but their lines faded. Maybe they were absorbed into later populations. Maybe they failed to reproduce. Maybe they wandered too far, or stayed too close to danger. Whatever the cause, their legacy is not in the dogs at our feet. It is in the spaces between names, and yet they mattered. Because domestication was not a singular, clean event. It was a process, slow and imperfect. It unfolded in waves, across continents, in camps large and small. Every failed lineage taught the next what to try, what to fear, what to tolerate. The survivors do not exist without the attempts that did not take root. These ghost lineages walked beside us. Even if their genes did not pass on, they howled in the dark. They guarded the sleeping. They ran with the hunt. And though they vanished, their presence shaped the paths that endured. What remains, even when bloodlines end, is influence. The shape of what followed was carved partly by what did not last. In the same way a river traces stone and leaves behind a changed surface, those lost lineages marked the course of domestication through their absence. Their stories are difficult to tell, not because they lack importance, but because the earth holds them loosely. A jawbone here, a tooth fragment there, isolated remains without context. No artifacts, no settlement layers, no clear evidence of continuity. They flicker in and out of the record like forgotten verses in a song, and yet, in recent years, advances in ancient DNA analysis have given these shadows a voice. Researchers have found traces of genetic material in prehistoric canid remains that do not match any modern dogs. In sites like Zhukov Island in Siberia, for example, the dogs used to pull sleds nearly 10,000 years ago show unique lineages. Some persisted, others vanished entirely. Their traits, once vital, now extinct. Why some lines ended is not always clear. Climate shifts may have played a role. Changing prey patterns could have left certain groups isolated, unable to survive. Or perhaps they simply faded because their behavior no longer matched the evolving needs of the humans they lived beside. A wolf dog that was too independent, too fearful, too slow to bond, it might have stopped being welcome in the camp. And without welcome, it could not endure. Cultural choices mattered too. In some groups, wolves may have been tolerated only briefly. A specific band of humans might have accepted their presence for a generation or two, then stopped. The reasons may have been practical or spiritual, remembered or forgotten. Once the tolerance was gone, the animals left or died out. Their bones remained, but the thread of connection was severed. Not all failure is failure in the moment. Many of these wolves likely lived full lives beside humans. They were fed, cared for, remembered. But when they died, their lineage did not continue. No pups carried their traits into the next century. No distant descendant curled up beside a modern hearth. And so their legacy shifted from biological to historical, from inherited to inferred. In the study of domestication, these silences speak loudly. They remind us that history is not built only by those who last. It is also shaped by those who tried. Every ghost lineage left behind a faint trace, a signal, a nudge in the long unfolding of what would eventually become the modern dog. We do not know their names, but we know they were there. And because they were there, the path changed. Paths are rarely straight in deep time. They loop, branch, vanish, and sometimes double back. The story of dog domestication is not a ladder. It is a forest of beginnings, many of which ended without leading anywhere we can follow. Some of those early companions were as genetically distinct from modern dogs as they were from wolves. Their skulls tell a story of change. Shorter snouts, altered tooth patterns, reduced bite force, but their DNA leads to silence. Their traits do not reappear. Their features do not resurface in later breeds. They were possibilities that the future did not keep. Still, they walked beside us. Their bones lie next to human tools. Their teeth mark the same reindeer bones that show flint cuts. In places like Prehistory in the Czech Republic, large canid skulls from around 30,000 years ago show unusual combinations of wolf and dog traits. Some scholars call them proto-dogs. Others remain cautious. But what's clear is that they lived with us and that they did not continue. These lost lineages also invite a humbler view of domestication. The idea that humans set out with purpose to tame the wolf, moulding it step by step into the dog, no longer holds. The evidence speaks of a messier truth, one of trial and error, of parallel experiments in many places at once, most of which came to nothing. It was not design, but drift, not mastery, but mutual adjustment, and even now, echoes of those vanished paths remain. In the genomes of Arctic dogs, researchers sometimes find fragments of lineages thought to be long gone, tiny remnants, buried deep, carried forward like seeds that refuse to die. In these fragments, we glimpse what might have been a temperament lost, a behavior once useful, but now forgotten. The ghost lineages remind us that domestication was not a straight road paved with progress. It was a process filled with pauses, with half-beginnings, with sparks that flared and faded. The wolves that stayed, that changed, that became dogs, did so not in a clean arc, but in the shadow of many who came close and did not remain. And so the story of how dogs came to be is also the story of those who almost were. The ones who slept near us but left no heirs. The ones whose bones lie beneath forgotten fires. The ones whose genes melted into the air. They are not ancestors, but they are part of the ancestry of trust. They taught the first lessons. They tested the earliest bonds. They softened the edge between fear and familiarity. Even if their line ended, their steps marked the trail. And in every dog that walks beside us now, there is a silence, a space where the ghost lineages still run. Some stayed. They lingered where others had vanished, built lives where older lines had faded, and in time, something changed. Not just behavior, not just proximity, but biology itself. 15,000 years ago, traces of a new kind of companion began to appear in the archaeological record. These were not wolves living near humans, nor wolf dogs hovering in between. These were animals that had crossed an invisible threshold. They were dogs not in name, not yet, but in structure, in gut, in genome. The shift was not sudden. It moved slowly, like ice melting under pressure, but in bone and in blood it left marks. Skulls grew shorter, teeth changed shape, brain size shifted slightly, reflecting reduced reactivity. Tails curled more often, ears bent forward, and deeper still, inside cells, something even more remarkable was happening. Their bodies were adapting to human food, not just the meat shared after a kill, but the scraps, the half-burned roots, the crushed grains, the things once considered waste. In populations across Europe, Asia, and eventually the Near East, some canids began to show signs of an altered gut microbiome. They were better at digesting starch. The genetic evidence is clear. Mutations in the AMY2B gene, the one that codes for pancreatic amylase, an enzyme critical for starch digestion, became more frequent in these animals. Wolves do not carry these variants in high numbers. Dogs do. This adaptation did not come from nowhere. It came from living alongside people who had begun, in small ways, to cook, to store, to leave behind a different kind of food. Humans were changing too. In some parts of the world, they began to shift from purely foraging to semi-sedentary life. Camps grew larger, food waste accumulated, and the animals most able to benefit from these new scraps gained an advantage. The calmest wolves, the least fearful, the ones that lingered longest, they were already on this path. But now, the path turned. It curved toward dependency, toward selection. It was not that humans saw this and chose it. Not at first. No one planned to make a dog, but the world was changing, and those who could bend with it survived. What emerged from this slow convergence was no longer just a shadow near the fire. It was something new, something that needed us, and was needed in return. The balance had shifted, not entirely, not everywhere, but enough to mark the moment, enough to say, this is when the story began to carry a different name. Names would come later, shaped by culture, geography, and language. But even without words, people began to treat these animals differently. They were fed more intentionally. Their presence was tolerated deeper inside the camp. Some were buried with care. Others left traces in painted caves or carved objects, as if their role had grown into something symbolic. The turning point was not marked by a single invention or event. It was marked by accumulation of small changes, repeated choices, quiet tolerances. These became traditions. And those traditions, passed across generations, began to create animals who could no longer survive without humans, and humans who could no longer imagine life without them. One of the most telling signals comes not from bone, but from the gut. The adaptation to starch-rich diets tells us more than just what dogs could eat. It tells us how closely they lived with us. The guts of animals reflect the guts of the people they live beside. Bacteria travel, enzymes adapt. A shared table, even one scattered with scraps on the ground, is a sign of shared fate. The presence of amylase gene variants, more frequent copies, more efficient expression gave these early dogs the ability to process the leftovers of cooked tubers, seeds and grains. These were not luxuries. In lean seasons, they were the only things left. The canids that could extract calories from them survived when others did not. This adaptation is not found in wolves. It is a signal of divergence, a sign that the relationship had shifted from tolerating proximity to internalizing it. Human food had become dog food, and in doing so, something fundamental had changed. But digestion was only one piece. Behavioral shifts continued too. Dogs became more attuned to human cues. Their bodies responded less intensely to stress. Their fight-or-flight reflexes muted slightly. They barked more often, perhaps as an evolved signal that served human needs, an alarm system, a call, a bridge of noise between the silent glances of early communication and the rich languages that would come later. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing signs of canine-human overlap. In what is now Germany, the burial at Bonfire Castle, dated to around 14,000 years ago, includes a dog interred with two humans. The dog had been cared for through illness. Its teeth suggest a diet similar to its people. This is not the burial of a scavenger. It is the burial of a companion. By this point, the difference could be seen, not only in how these animals looked, but in how they lived. Their lives were woven into ours not only beside us, but because of us. The wildness had not vanished, but it had bent, softened, learned to follow without fear. The fire, once a boundary, had become a centre, and around that centre, a new kind of animal had taken its place. Their place was not always at the centre, but it was always within reach, close enough to see the hands working hides, close enough to smell the stew bubbling in the pit, close enough to be called, even if no words were used. By now, their presence was more than tolerated. It was expected. The dog had become a feature of daily life, not just a tool, not just a shadow, but a presence with a role. It warned of danger. It cleaned the scraps. It followed the children. It walked the perimeter before sleep, and when the firelight flickered low, it curled nearby, as much a part of the camp as the people themselves. What had begun as curiosity, as hunger, as a gamble across the edge of species, was now an alliance, still imperfect, still evolving, but stable enough to spread, and spread it did, across continents, across climates, across cultures. Dogs appeared in Siberia, in the Levant, in what would become Europe and Central Asia. Not all the same. Not all from one ancestor. The genomic record shows multiple origins. Dogs that emerged from different wolf populations. Dogs that carried local traits, then mixed with others. It was not one domestication, but many. A pattern written more like a constellation than a line. Some became large, shaggy, made for pulling sleds. Others stayed small and wiry, quick on uneven terrain. Some worked, some guarded, some simply stayed close. But across all these variations was a common thread, an ability to live with us. Not just near us, with us. That ability was written into their biology, shaped by the strange environment that only humans could create, one of fire, food storage, sleep cycles, and shared danger. In adapting to us, they became more than themselves, and we, in turn, began to adapt around them. Our camps grew safer, our hunts grew broader, our children grew up alongside something that watched over them, played with them, and never wandered far. This mutual shaping was not planned. It was not engineered. It happened through attention, proximity, repetition. It happened because enough wolves stayed and enough humans allowed it, because behavior became biology, and biology became memory. Looking back, this period stands out as the moment when the dog, as we understand it, truly began to exist, not in full form, not yet refined, but recognizably different from the wolves that came before. It was the result of generations of quiet selection, not through cages or whips, but through shared lives. And when the camp moved again, the dogs moved too, not behind, not ahead, alongside. A new kind of companion, shaped not just by time and mutation, but by firelight, footsteps, and the long road walked together. And together, they arrived at something new, not just a road, but a place, a threshold, the moment when people began to stay. The shift from wandering to dwelling did not happen all at once. It came in pieces, a longer stay here, a deeper pit for grain, a wall built from stones instead of branches, But once humans began to linger in one place, the dogs lingered too. And in that stillness, their purpose began to change. They were no longer just travelers or hunters. They became watchers. Sentinels posted not at the edge of a herd, but at the doorway of a home. Their eyes scanned the horizon not for game, but for strangers. Their bark, once a warning to others, became a message to the people they lived with. It meant something was near, something unfamiliar. This was the age when dogs became guardians. The idea of territory was different now. Before, the land belonged to no one. Camps rose and fell like breath. But with longer stays came boundaries of tools, of stored food, of children sleeping behind woven screens. Dogs helped mark those lines. Their bodies, alert and coiled at entrances, told others, this place is watched, this place is not empty. And so they were selected again. Not by plan, but by result. The ones who barked sooner. The ones who stayed close. The ones who knew the difference between a wandering animal and a stranger on 2 feet. These were the dogs who were fed, who were kept, who were allowed to raise their young nearby. Archaeology offers quiet confirmation. In early settlements from the Natufian sites in the Levant to early Neolithic villages in Anatolia and southeastern Europe, dog remains are found within the living spaces. Their bones are not scattered like refuse. They lie beneath thresholds, near hearths, inside walls. Some are buried with care. Others seem to have died in place, as if they had lived their entire lives beside a doorway. This closeness brought new meaning. The dog was no longer just a partner in movement. It had become a symbol of stillness, of home, and in guarding that home it became something more than useful. It became trusted. These were not pets in the modern sense. They were working animals. But their work now touched the edges of culture. They stood at the boundary between inside and out, between kin and other, between the known and the unknown. And as humans turned fields into farms, shelters into villages, the dogs turned too. Their eyes faced outward, but their hearts had settled inward. And inward was where the food was kept, where infants slept, where fire warmed the bones of the old and the sick. It was where memory began to root, not just in stories, but in places. And around those places, dogs circled. They were no longer drifting companions. They had become part of the structure of life. Their presence altered how humans responded to danger. A bark in the night bought a few extra seconds. A growl near the edge of a clearing made intruders pause. These small advantages, repeated over time, reshaped survival. Their bodies adapted too. As villages grew, dogs became more diverse. Some remained large and powerful, suited for protection or pulling loads. Others grew smaller, more agile, able to slip between fences and follow humans indoors. Selection was not uniform. It was shaped by function, climate, and need. And over time, the dog became not one thing, but many. In the highlands, some guarded flocks. In river valleys, others slept at doorways. In coastal settlements, dogs learned to scavenge fish, to follow boats, to wait at the shore. Their roles expanded with human life. They were not merely adapting to us, they were adapting with us. And humans noticed. In early figurines and painted walls, dogs begin to appear not just as animals, but as symbols. Their posture attentive, facing outward, is captured again and again. Not eating, not hunting, watching. It was not only function that mattered. Dogs began to reflect something about the humans who kept them. A powerful guardian at the edge of a compound spoke of wealth. A sleek, decorated animal at a chieftain's side hinted at status. Some dogs were given ornaments. Others were buried with offerings. A few appear to have been mourned. This was the beginning of symbolic ownership. The dog became more than useful. It became part of identity. Not for all people, not everywhere, but in enough places to mark a shift. Still, they were not yet fully domestic in the modern sense. They bred freely. They roamed the edges. They could still disappear into the wild and return weeks later. But the trend was clear. The bond had deepened from coexistence to dependence, and from dependence to distinction. To be a dog now meant something different than it had before. It meant being part of a social world, not only among other dogs, but among humans, reading their voices, anticipating their moods, sleeping near their children, walking their thresholds. Where once the fire had been the centre, now the home was. And wherever that home spread, a dog was never far. Distance no longer defined their loyalty. Whether in fields, along rivers, or within clustered homes, dogs remained close. Proximity had become part of their nature, not just staying near the camp, but choosing to stay near people, and people noticed the difference. A dog that barked at the wrong moment might be ignored, but one that barked just before a stranger arrived, that animal was remembered. The memory passed through story, then through preference. Pups from sharp-eyed mothers were kept. Lines of keen hearing, quick reaction, steady nerves. These were shaped not by breed names but by repetition. In time, these traits became part of how humans planned. Dogs were placed at entryways, tied loosely during market days, brought forward when traders arrived. They served not just as protection, but as presence. They gave form to intention. To display a dog was to say, I live here. I guard this. I have something to lose. Some were trained to guard flocks, following the herds on long seasonal migrations. Others learned the boundaries of gardens, of grain stores, of drying racks, hung with fish or game. Still others became guardians of the intangible warding off spirits in belief systems, appearing in myths, standing between the world of the living and whatever came after. These roles grew richer, as human society grew more layered. A dog at the edge of a village meant one thing. A dog beside a temple meant another. In each case, the animal had stepped beyond its original reason for being close. It had become woven into the way people understood safety, status, and sacredness. In many early cultures, dogs were the first line of defense, against predators, against rivals, against what could not yet be named. They did not only chase threats away, sometimes their presence prevented threat altogether. The knowledge that a settlement had dogs could be enough to change a traveller's path or a predator's approach, and with time, something deeper took hold. These animals were no longer just eyes and ears. They were memory keepers. A dog who stayed through generations, who had pups, who watched children grow, became a living thread between past and present. In communities where few things were written down, where homes were rebuilt from season to season, dogs offered continuity. They remembered faces. They remembered sounds. And when the same dog greeted someone year after year, the people remembered too. These animals, once wild, had become part of how humans recognized home. So they remained not behind fences, not locked away, but seated at the edges, at thresholds, at doors and borders, always facing outward, yet always belonging within. They were no longer just companions, they were the watchers of what mattered. And across villages, pastures, and growing towns, their role was clear. Where humans stayed, dogs stood guard. But some did more than guard. They stayed not because they were told, or because they were bred to, but because they wanted to. In the quiet moments after danger had passed, after firelight softened the dark, something else stirred. It was not just mutual advantage, not entirely. There had always been practical reasons. Dogs warned of predators. Humans shared food. The exchange was ancient, undeniable. But across the generations, something deeper took root. A pull not of instinct but of emotion. You could see it in the way a dog rested its head near a sleeping child, in the way a person reached, without thinking, to scratch behind an ear. These were gestures without agenda. Movements shaped by comfort, not survival. Familiarity had become affection. No one could say exactly when it started. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of trust, of days spent together, of meals shared, of losses mourned, a pup lost to the cold, a hunter who didn't return. In grief, as in celebration, the dog remained close. And over time, that closeness became its own language. Not of words, but of presence. Sitting near, walking beside, watching, even when nothing needed to be watched. The kind of companionship that doesn't ask for anything, that simply stays. There are no treaties between species, no carved stones to mark the first pact, but evidence exists in bone and ash, dogs buried with care, with flowers, with tools, with humans, not tossed aside, not cast off, but laid down as equals. In one site, a dog is found with its head resting on a person's arm. In another, the remains of a young animal show signs of prolonged illness and healing. Someone had tended to it, fed it, waited through its weakness. There was no utility in that, only care. The first friendship was not created. It was grown, slowly, patiently, not from command, but from recognition. Each species learning, across the quiet divide, that the other could be trusted. And in that trust, something rare was born. An alliance not built on dominance, not driven by necessity alone, but formed from the simple act of being near, of choosing not to run, of choosing, day after day, to return. This was not about ownership. Not yet. Not in the way we understand it now. It was about presence. Two kinds of beings who had every reason to fear each other, choosing instead to share space, to share time, and in that shared time, they found something that neither could have shaped alone. Loneliness had always been part of the human condition, even among others, even around fire. The weight of knowing, of remembering, of wondering what lay beyond the stars or beneath the soil. It was a burden that no other creature seemed to share. But the dog came close, not in words, not in answers, but in presence, in watching the same horizon, in pricking its ears to the same distant sound, in lying still, as though it too sensed the importance of silence. There is something remarkable in the way dogs learn to read us, to notice not just movement but mood, to tilt their heads at sadness, to nudge with a paw when our shoulders fell. It wasn't language, but it was something adjacent, a mutual grammar of attention, and humans in turn read them back. A raised hackle, a tucked tail, a slow blink. Over time, the signals became fluent. We knew when to wait, when to reach, when to speak softly. We knew when a bark meant fear, or warning, or joy. This wasn't training. It was intimacy, grown through repetition, through winter nights and summer hunts, through shared routines, through memory. And in that intimacy, something softened. The same hands that once held spears now reached out gently. The same mouths that called warnings now whispered names. In some communities, we see the beginnings of that shift. Dogs with symbolic roles, perhaps even spiritual ones. Animals not only of use, but of meaning. The archaeological record offers hints. Carvings of dogs beside gods, ashes mixed together in burial, paws painted on walls where only people had stood before. It's impossible to say exactly what was felt, but the care in the gesture is unmistakable. Friendship here was not a metaphor. It was felt in flesh and breath, in sleeping beside warmth that was not your own, in being watched, not for food, but for return. And as settlements grew, and lives became more complex, the dogs stayed. They changed with us. They adapted again. But beneath the roles, the guard, the herder, the hunter, something ancient remained, a closeness that needed no reason. Even now, thousands of years later, it lingers, in the way a dog chooses to follow, in the way it waits at the door, in the way it sighs at our feet, echoes of that first understanding, that quiet agreement made without words, carried forward in muscle and instinct, not commanded, not inherited, chosen, every day, again and again. And when the world was too much, too wide, too quiet there, at the edge of the fire was another heartbeat. Warmth moved both ways. It was not just humans who offered shelter, food, fire. Dogs offered something quieter, a steadiness, a gaze that held no questions, a loyalty not purchased, but given freely. Over time, the relationship deepened. It became ritual, a bowl placed in the same spot, a greeting in the morning, a farewell, even for a short absence. These small patterns wove an invisible thread between species. They were not necessary in a survival sense, but they persisted, which made them real. And with that reality came something rare in nature: comfort, not the absence of fear, but the presence of calm. The awareness that, even in uncertainty, you are not alone. Dogs brought that into human life, and humans gave it back. This was not about tools or roles anymore. It was about recognition. The look that said, "You are known to me." The moment when a sleeping figure stirred and found eyes already watching, not with expectation, but with care. In every society where dogs appear, this intimacy re-emerges, not always in the same form. Some cultures worship them, others work them hard. But across the span of continents and millennia, the pattern repeats. A dog at the edge of the story. Sometimes a hero, sometimes a witness, always near. They helped shape how humans thought about loyalty, about protection, even about love. Not the love of possession, but of presence, of choosing to stay, again and again, without being asked. This was the first friendship. It did not begin in words. It did not need ceremony. It happened because two kinds of animal, both social, both intelligent, both wary of the dark, found each other. One offered fire, the other, sight in the night. One offered scraps, the other, warning. One sang around the flames, the other listened, ears twitching at distant sounds. And as the wind howled across the Mammoth Steppe, as ice groaned in the distance, as stars turned above in ancient silence, something unprecedented held steady in that flickering circle of light. Trust. A trust that outlasted the bones it was born from, that passed through lineages and languages, that still sits at our feet, waiting for us to move, or speak, or simply rest. We often speak of how dogs became ours, but perhaps the deeper truth is simpler, older, and harder to name. We became theirs too. Some part of them never stopped watching us. Even as dogs changed in shape, in role, in name, the wolf inside did not vanish. It stepped back. It softened, but it remained. We see it in moments. A sudden stillness in the tall grass. The way a dog turns its head toward a sound too distant for us to hear. The way it follows us, even when we carry no food, no orders, no need. That presence is not obedience. It is something older, a thread that was never cut. In the bark of a dog echoing down a village street, something ancient speaks. It is not just warning. It is not just excitement. It is a voice shaped by thousands of years, by cold nights, by wind howling through open plains. The sound carries memory of hunting beside us, of sleeping near fire, of choosing to stay when running was safer. And in the gaze of a wolf, when it locks eyes from across a clearing, we feel the other side of that memory. Not just fear, recognition, a spark of what once was, of what almost was, of what still might be. They did not forget. The wolves who stayed wild and the dogs who grew tame both carried forward a record that was never written down. It lives in the body, in instinct, in closeness, and in caution. For the wolf, that memory is held in distance, in territory guarded without maps, in family units forged without speech, in loyalty so complete it needs no explanation. And for the dog, it is held in nearness, in the way it watches a sleeping human, in the way it waits by the door. These two expressions, wild and domestic, are not opposites. They are echoes of the same origin, divergent but not broken, different but not strangers. Some breeds of dogs still look so much like wolves, it unsettles us. The yellow eyes, the lean body, the silence, as if we have called back something that never entirely left, as if the transformation, for all its success, still carries a shadow of where it began. And maybe that is why the bond endures. Not because dogs are entirely unlike wolves, but because they are not. Because we remember, even dimly, the night when one animal stepped into the circle of firelight, and we made room. That gesture has never fully stopped. It lives in the way a dog curls near our feet, in the way a wolf follows at the edge of sight, in the way neither has fully forgotten the shape of the other. In that shared remembering, the first friendship still breathes. Breathing was always part of the bond. Not words, not commands, just presence. One species resting near another. The steady rhythm of lungs in the dark. The unspoken trust of sleeping near something once feared. We still carry the shape of that moment in our stories. Myths where dogs guide souls through the afterlife. Legends where wolves raise children lost in the woods. Tales where the animal does not simply serve, but understands, where it chooses to stay. Science tells us about genes and skull shapes, about selective pressures and adaptation. But the deeper truth isn't just in the bone. It's in the silence that passed between species, in the decisions made without language, in the nights survived not alone. And even now, that truth lingers. A village dog that guards a threshold without being trained. A stray that follows a traveller for days. A wolf that pauses, stares, then vanishes into the brush. These are not accidents, they are echoes. The wolf still remembers what it meant to step toward the fire. To be watched, to be fed, to be feared, to be accepted. It remembers not in thoughts, but in instincts, in how it teaches its young to listen before leaping, to circle before trusting. And the dog remembers too. The sound of our footsteps, the scent of our grief, the importance of staying close when something changes in our voice. These are not tricks. They are memories shaped by thousands of shared seasons. In this way, the friendship never ended. It simply changed form. From cave to village, from hunter's companion to child's guardian, from working partner to family. Even the tension between wolf and dog, the pull between wildness and loyalty, is part of the legacy. We see it in breeds that struggle to be still, in animals that cannot sleep unless someone they love is near, in eyes that flick toward the door, waiting. What the wolf still remembers, the dog still expresses. The arc between them is not clean. It is woven, tangled, overlapping, like the trail of a long journey walked together, sometimes side by side, sometimes apart. And humans remember too, not always consciously, but in how we look to animals for companionship, for protection, for solace. We feel the gap they fill, even when we do not name it. It is not merely a desire for service, it is a return to something older, something made of firelight, silence, breath, and in that return, the past flickers through the present, alive, unfinished, watching us still. Stillness was the beginning, before the chase, before the howl, before the fire. Just two eyes meeting across a breath of snow, one belonging to a creature shaped by survival, the other to a creature just beginning to remember what connection could mean. That first meeting never fully ended. It only moved forward into the rhythms of camps and hunts and hearths, into 1,000 small decisions to stay, to watch, to trust. And every time a dog looks up when we speak, or waits when we falter, it answers a question we've been asking since that night. Will you remain? So much has changed. Dogs have scattered with us to every corner of the world. They have been shaped into hundreds of forms, some tiny, some immense, some bred to run, others to sit quietly. They have worn armour in war, pulled sleds through wind-carved ice, sat beside queens, licked the faces of the forgotten. And yet, beneath the variety, the essential bond remains. Not one of control, but of companionship. Not forged by force, but by nearness, over generations uncounted. Even now, there are places where wolves follow at a distance, where humans leave food at the forest edge, where old instincts pause before old fears. And in those moments not quite wild, not quite domestic, something ancient hums quietly beneath the surface. A reminder that the line we drew between us and them was never absolute, that we did not tame wolves so much as meet them in the middle. That trust was earned, not engineered. In the bark of a dog, in the hush of a watching wolf, in the places where fire once met frost, we hear it. A voice carried not in language, but in gesture, in breath, in memory passed through muscle and marrow. The story of how wolves became dogs is not just a story of biology or history. It is a story of relationship, of two species who saw, in each other, not just threat, but possibility. And that possibility still lives in every shared glance, every returned step, every quiet moment where no words are needed. A dog curls at the foot of a bed. A wolf watches from the ridge. Both carry something older than us, something we were given, and must choose to remember, because deep inside them, the memory never faded, and perhaps, deep inside us, it never will. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for tracing the scent of ancient fires and shared glances across the frostbitten steppe with me. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you focus, or just gave you something to wonder about, I'm glad we could share this time. Every journey leaves behind an echo, a single memory that stays. A wolf circling just beyond the flickering firelight, a cautious hand offering a scrap of meat under the stars, the slow bloom of trust in a world still wild. If a memory is with you now, feel free to leave it in the comments below as a quiet offering, a shared piece of a story that never truly ended, and perhaps that memory may just find its way back in a future story we can share together. Until then, as always, stay curious, stay thoughtful,